A woman ran through the storm, rain lashing against her bare scalp, blood mingling with water as it trickled down her shoulder. The night swallowed her footsteps, but couldn't silence her ragged breathing as she stumbled through mud that seemed determined to claim her. Lightning cracked the sky open, illuminating her desperate flight across the unfamiliar terrain. When she finally fell, face first into the cold embrace of Nevada mud, Abigail Harrington didn't immediately rise. Her body, betraying the limits of human endurance, trembled with exhaustion and pain. Blood seeped through her torn dress where a knife had sliced her shoulder hours earlier. The rain beat mercilessly against her exposed scalp, each drop a reminder of her humiliation. She turned her face skyward, letting the rain wash away tears she refused to acknowledge. "I will not die, Thomas," she whispered to the storm. "I will come back." Her words disappeared into the thunder, but the promise remained. 2 weeks earlier, the cemetery in Whisper Ridge was small but well-tended. A surprising touch of civility in a territory still raw from the war and rough with the dreams of those who'd come west to escape its memory. Today, it welcomed another body to its embrace. Dr. Thomas Harrington, age 31, beloved husband of Abigail, healer to all who sought his care. Abigail stood beside the fresh grave, her black mourning dress a stark contrast to the golden prairie grass that surrounded the cemetery. At 27, widowhood felt like an ill-fitting garment she'd been forced to wear. She remained still as the last mourners departed, leaving only the minister who squeezed her gloved hand with practiced sympathy before he too disappeared down the dusty path that led back to town. Only then did she allow her shoulders to slump beneath the weight of her grief. Thomas had been more than her husband. He had been her anchor in this strange territory so far from the Boston streets where they had both been raised. His decision to move west after the war had been born of idealism, a physician untainted by allegiance to either side, eager to help rebuild a fractured nation by tending to those who sought new beginnings. "I never took you for the theatrical type." The voice startled Abigail from her reverie. She turned to find 4 men approaching, their faces bearing enough similarity to her late husband's to mark them as kin, though she had never met them before today's service. "Mr. Blackwood," she acknowledged, addressing the eldest, Joseph, a broad-shouldered man whose handlebar mustache did little to soften the hard lines of his face. Beside him stood his brothers, Victor with his shrewd eyes, Raymond whose mouth seemed permanently fixed in a sneer, and Stanley, the youngest at perhaps 25, who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Mrs. Harrington," Joseph replied with a slight tip of his hat that contained no genuine respect. "My cousins and I thought it proper to offer our condolences now that the townsfolk have gone." "Thank you for coming," Abigail said, forcing politeness into her voice. Thomas never spoke much of his mother's family. "I believe you were raised in Virginia?" Something flickered in Joseph's eyes, a hardening, a coldness that made Abigail instinctively straighten her spine. "We were, before your husband's countrymen burned our family home to the ground." The bitterness in his tone made the unspoken accusation clear. Thomas had fought for the Union, while the Blackwoods had bled for the Confederacy. Even here, hundreds of miles from the battlefields, the war's shadow stretched long. "My husband treated soldiers from both sides," Abigail said quietly. "He believed suffering recognized no flag." "A convenient philosophy," Victor chimed in, adjusting his spectacles, "especially when one side emerges victorious." Abigail felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. These men had not come to pay respects to their cousin. They had come to measure his widow. "If you'll excuse me, gentlemen, it's been a long day." She made to move past them, but Joseph's hands settled on her arm, not quite gripping, but certainly impeding. "We understand Thomas acquired some property here," he said smoothly. Family property, one might argue, given the Blackwood blood that ran in his veins. "My husband purchased our home and practice with his own earnings," Abigail replied, pulling her arm free with as much dignity as she could muster. "If you have concerns about inheritance, I suggest consulting the town lawyer." "Oh, we intend to," Raymond said with a smirk. "We've taken rooms in town. We'll be staying a while." As Abigail walked away, she could feel their eyes on her back, calculating and cold. Thomas had mentioned his mother's family only a handful of times, always with a distant sadness. Now she understood why. The house that Abigail returned to felt cavernous in its emptiness. For 2 weeks it had been filled with the sounds of Thomas's labored breathing as the illness claimed him bit by bit. Now silence reigned, broken only by her footsteps across wooden floors that no longer felt like home. She removed her bonnet and gloves, setting them on the table in the foyer. The mirror reflected a woman she barely recognized, pale, hollow-eyed, her chestnut hair pulled back severely beneath the mourning cap. Thomas had loved her hair, often joking that it was what had first caught his eye when they met at a medical charity function in Boston. "You look like autumn itself had taken human form," he'd told her once, fingers threaded through the reddish-brown waves. The memory pierced her heart. She turned away from the mirror and headed to Thomas's study, a room she had avoided since his death. It smelled of him still, leather-bound medical texts, the faint trace of pipe tobacco he'd indulged in occasionally, and the herbal remedies he'd insisted were as valuable as the newer medicines arriving from the East. She sat at his desk, running her fingers over the polished surface. There was work to be done, patients to notify, bills to settle, a life to somehow continue. But for now, she allowed herself to simply be still in this space that held so much of him. A soft knock at the front door roused her. She opened it to find Harriet Blackwood, Joseph's wife, standing on her porch. Unlike her husband, Harriet made no pretense at politeness. Her mouth was set in a thin line of disapproval as she took in Abigail's appearance. "Mrs. Harrington," she said, the name sounding like an insult on her tongue. "I thought it appropriate to call, as we're family now." Abigail doubted the sincerity of the sentiment, but stepped aside to let the woman enter. Harriet moved through the house with the air of someone conducting an inspection, her gaze lingering on the furnishings, the paintings, the silver frames holding photographs of Abigail and Thomas. "From Boston, aren't you?" Harriet finally spoke, seating herself without invitation. "Yes," Abigail replied, remaining standing. As was Thomas. Harriet's hum carried volumes of judgment. "We were surprised when we heard Thomas had married, more surprised to learn his bride was a Northerner." "The war has been over for 12 years, Mrs. Blackwood." "Has it?" Harriet's smile was cold, perhaps on paper. "But some wounds never heal, do they? Some betrayals cut too deep. I fail to see what this has to do with Thomas or myself. Don't you? The Harrington name may have protected you thus far, Mrs. Harrington, but Thomas is gone now." Harriet stood, smoothing her skirts. "This territory has a way of sorting people. Those who belong and those who don't." The threat, veiled though it was, hung in the air between them. "I appreciate your call, Mrs. Blackwood," Abigail said, moving toward the door, "but I have matters to attend to." "Of course," Harriet replied, retrieving her parasol. "We'll speak again soon, I'm sure. After all, families should stick together in times of grief." After Harriet left, Abigail leaned against the closed door, a sense of foreboding settling over her like a shroud. That night, unable to sleep, Abigail returned to Thomas's study. Something about Harriet's visit, about the calculating looks from the Blackwood brothers, had unsettled her deeply. Thomas had left everything in order. He was meticulous that way. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she was missing. She began opening drawers, sorting through papers, not entirely sure what she was looking for. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of medical journals, her fingers found a small wooden box she'd never seen before. It was simple but beautiful, carved with an intricate pattern of leaves and vines. The key was tied to the bottom with a piece of string. Abigail opened it with trembling hands. Inside, she found a folded piece of paper that appeared to be half of a map. The lines were precise, showing what looked like a section of mountains and a river, but it ended abruptly at the middle, as though torn. Next to it lay a small leather pouch. When she emptied it into her palm, several gold flakes and a small nugget caught the lamplight. "Thomas," she whispered, "what were you keeping from me?" Beneath these items was a letter addressed to her in her husband's familiar handwriting. She broke the seal and began to read. "My dearest Abigail, if you are reading this, then my fears have been realized, and I have left you alone in a place that was meant to be our new beginning. For this, I am deeply sorry. There is much I have not told you, partly to protect you, and partly because I hoped it would never become necessary. My grandfather, Edward Harrington, came west long before the war and discovered a gold deposit in these mountains. He kept its location secret, sharing it only with his son, my father, and eventually with me. The enclosed map is half of the key to finding it. The other half I have entrusted to someone else for safekeeping. Should anything happen to me under suspicious circumstances, seek out Luther Wells, the town lawyer. He knows what to do. I fear my mother's family may have learned of this inheritance. The Blackwoods have always valued wealth over principle, and the war has left them desperate. Be wary of them, my love. Know that every moment with you has been the true treasure of my life. Forever yours, Thomas. Abigail read the letter twice more, her mind racing. Gold, a secret inheritance. The sudden appearance of relatives who had shown no interest in Thomas while he lived. It painted a picture far more sinister than she had imagined. She carefully replaced everything in the box except the letter, which she folded and tucked into her dress pocket. Then she hid the box behind a loose brick in the fireplace, a hiding spot Thomas had shown her when they first moved in, joking that every home should have its secrets. Tomorrow she would visit Luther Wells. Tonight she would try to sleep, though she suspected rest would elude her. She was right. The next morning brought no opportunity to visit the lawyer. Patients began arriving at dawn, people who had depended on Thomas and now looked to his widow with hopeful eyes. While not a physician herself, Abigail had assisted her husband enough to handle minor ailments and dispense medications he had prepared. By mid-afternoon, she was exhausted but satisfied with having helped a dozen townsfolk. She was cleaning the examination room when the bell above the door jangled. "I'm afraid I'm closing for the day," she called, not looking up from her task. "That's quite all right, Mrs. Harrington. We didn't come for medical attention." She turned to find Joseph Blackwood standing in the doorway, his brothers arrayed behind him like a jury. "Gentlemen," she acknowledged, straightening her apron, "how may I help you?" "We've been reviewing Thomas's affairs," Joseph said, stepping inside and removing his hat. "It seems there are some irregularities." "Irregularities?" Abigail kept her voice steady, though her heart had begun to race. "Financial matters, property deeds, things that concern the family. I wasn't aware that you had any claim to Thomas's affairs." Victor stepped forward, adjusting his spectacles. "Blood is thicker than marriage vows, Mrs. Harrington, especially when those vows were so recent." "5 years is hardly recent," Abigail replied. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to finish." "We know about the gold," Raymond blurted, earning a sharp look from Joseph. A cold weight settled in Abigail's stomach, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play innocent," Joseph said, his tone hardening. "Thomas found something in these mountains, something that rightfully belongs to the Blackwood family. We want what's ours. If Thomas had anything of value, he would have mentioned it in his will. I suggest you speak with Mr. Wells." "We already have," Victor said with a thin smile. "Strangely, he claims to know nothing of any special inheritance." Abigail felt a flicker of fear. Had they gotten to Wells already? "Then I'm afraid I can't help you," she said, moving toward the door to show them out. "Now, please," Joseph's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with bruising force. "We're not finished, Mrs. Harrington." "Release me this instant," she demanded, trying to pull away. "Not until you tell us where Thomas hid it," he growled. "The map, the gold, all of it." "I don't know what you're talking about. Thomas left me nothing but this house and his practice." Stanley, who had remained silent until now, shifted uncomfortably. "Joseph, perhaps we should—" "Be quiet," Joseph snapped without looking at his youngest brother. His eyes, cold and calculating, remained fixed on Abigail. "We know Thomas was dying for weeks. Plenty of time for him to tell you his secrets. Plenty of time for you to plan." "Plan what?" Abigail finally wrenched her arm free. "My husband died of pneumonia after treating half the town during an outbreak. If you're suggesting otherwise—" "We're not suggesting," Raymond cut in. "We know." "Know what exactly?" Abigail demanded, anger beginning to replace her fear. Victor stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "That Thomas Harrington was murdered, poisoned, by his loving wife." The accusation hung in the air, so outrageous that for a moment Abigail could only stare. "Get out," she finally managed, her voice shaking with rage. "Get out of my house this instant." "Your house?" Joseph laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Not for long, Mrs. Harrington. Not once the town learns what kind of woman they have harbored." They left, but the threat remained, settling around Abigail like a noose slowly tightening. For the next week, Abigail tried to continue as normally as possible, though she felt eyes on her everywhere she went. Whispers followed her in the general store. Conversations stopped when she entered the post office. Patients began canceling appointments. The Blackwoods were spreading their poison throughout Whisper Ridge, and it was working. She attempted twice to see Luther Wells, only to be told he was unavailable. On her third try, his clerk informed her that Mr. Wells had left town suddenly on urgent business and would not return for several weeks. Too convenient to be coincidence. She had just returned home from this disappointing news when she found Harriet Blackwood on her porch, accompanied by three other women Abigail recognized as prominent wives from town. "Mrs. Harrington," Harriet said with false sweetness, "we've come to discuss a delicate matter." Abigail, tired of pretense, didn't invite them in. "What do you want, Mrs. Blackwood?" "We've heard rumors," said Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife, at least having the grace to look uncomfortable, "concerning Dr. Harrington's passing." "My husband died of pneumonia," Abigail stated flatly. "The same illness that took Mr. Roberts and the Miller child last month." "Did he?" Harriet's smile was venomous. "Or did he die because his Yankee wife wanted his inheritance for herself?" "That's absurd," Abigail replied, though she could see from their expressions that at least some of them believed it. "Thomas and I came west together to build a life. Everything we have, we built together. Yet how convenient that he should die just as his true family arrived," Harriet pressed, just as questions about certain properties were being raised. "I don't know what Thomas's cousins have told you, but they are lying. They appeared only after his death, claiming inheritance rights where none exist." "We've known the Blackwoods for years, Mrs. Williams," the general store owner's wife said primly. "They're respected throughout the territory. You, on the other hand, are an outsider." "An outsider who has treated your children and neighbors for 5 years," Abigail retorted, anger rising. "Who sat with your mother in her final hours, Mrs. Williams, when no one else would." A flicker of doubt crossed Mrs. Williams's face, but Harriet wasn't finished. "We've come to suggest you consider leaving Whisper Ridge," she said, dropping all pretense. "For your own good, before things become unpleasant." Abigail looked at each woman in turn, these pillars of a community that had once welcomed her and Thomas with open arms. Now they stood arrayed against her, convinced by nothing more than whispers and insinuations. "I have done nothing wrong," she said clearly. "I will not be driven from my home by lies." "Then you'll face the consequences," Harriet said, her eyes glittering with malice. "The territory has its own justice for women who poison their husbands." They left, and Abigail closed the door with shaking hands. Lies could be more deadly than disease in a place like this, she knew. The war had taught everyone that much. That night, Abigail couldn't sleep. The house creaked and settled around her, each sound making her start. Thomas's letter was hidden beneath her mattress now, the box still concealed in the fireplace. She debated whether to retrieve it, to flee while she still could. But where would she go? Back east to a family that had disowned her for marrying a man who chose healing over profit? She had no money beyond what was needed to maintain the practice. No friends close enough to trust with her life. A sudden crash from downstairs jolted her fully awake. Someone was in the house. She slipped from bed and grabbed the small pistol Thomas had insisted she keep in the bedside table. Her hands trembled as she checked that it was loaded, just as he had taught her. The floorboards creaked beneath her bare feet as she moved to the bedroom door, listening. Multiple voices. Men, trying to be quiet but betrayed by the occasional clink of glass or muffled curse. Rather than confront them, Abigail moved to the window. The drop to the ground was significant but not impossible. She opened it carefully, wincing at every squeak of the frame. Cool night air rushed in as she prepared to climb out. The bedroom door burst open behind her. "Going somewhere?" Joseph Blackwood's voice was slurred with alcohol, but no less menacing for it. Behind him stood his brothers, Raymond holding a lantern high to illuminate the scene. Abigail raised the pistol. "Get out of my house!" Joseph laughed, the sound echoing in the darkened room. "Your house? I don't think so, Mrs. Harrington." "Not anymore, for sure." He advanced, seemingly unconcerned by the weapon pointed at his chest. "In fact, I'm not sure you're Mrs. Harrington at all. A real wife wouldn't have poisoned her husband." "I didn't poison anyone," Abigail insisted, the gun steady now in her righteous anger. "Thomas died of pneumonia after treating the sick." You're using his death to steal what isn't yours. Are we? Victor stepped forward, his spectacles reflecting the lamplight. Or are we reclaiming what was stolen from us? The war took everything, Mrs. Harrington. Our home, our livelihood, our dignity. Thomas knew that. He promised to help us rebuild. Then why didn't he mention you once in 5 years? Abigail challenged. Why did he warn me about you in a letter before his death? It was a mistake to reveal she had a letter. Joseph's expression sharpened, his intoxication seemingly evaporating in an instant. What letter? He demanded. Where is it? Somewhere you'll never find it, she replied, backing toward the window. Now get out before I pull this trigger. You won't shoot, Raymond sneered. You're not the type. Try me, Abigail said and meant it. For a tense moment, they stared at each other. The only sound the faint hiss of the lantern and Abigail's own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Then Stanley, who had remained in the doorway, spoke. She has the map. I saw it in her hand yesterday when I was watching the house. Abigail's blood ran cold. They'd been spying on her. Where is it? Joseph demanded, taking another step forward. Stay back, Abigail warned, cocking the hammer. The map, Mrs. Harrington, and the letter. Then we'll go. Joseph's voice had taken on a reasonable tone that was somehow more frightening than his anger. We're family, after all. We can settle this like civilized people. There's nothing civilized about breaking into a widow's home in the middle of the night, Abigail replied. Now back away from the door so I can leave. You're not going anywhere, Raymond snarled, moving suddenly to his right. Abigail tracked him with the pistol, momentarily taking her eyes off Joseph. A critical error. He lunged forward, grabbing for the gun. She fired reflexively, the shot deafeningly loud in the confined space. Joseph howled as the bullet grazed his shoulder, but his momentum carried him into her. They fell together, the pistol skittering across the floor. Abigail fought with a desperation born of knowing what would happen if she lost. She clawed at Joseph's face, kneed him in the stomach, but he outweighed her by 100 pounds. Within moments, he had her pinned, his face contorted with rage. You shot me, he spat, blood dripping from his shoulder onto her nightgown. You actually shot me. Get off her, Stanley said from somewhere behind them. Joseph, this isn't right. Shut up, Raymond snapped. She just tried to kill your brother. After we broke into her house, Stanley protested, but his voice held no authority. Joseph ignored them both, his attention focused entirely on Abigail. Where is the map? Each word was punctuated by tightening his grip on her wrists until she thought the bones might snap. I don't have it, she gasped. I've never seen any map. Liar. He released one of her wrists to strike her across the face, hard enough to make her vision blur. You Yankee whore, you think you can steal from us? You think we'll let you get away with killing our blood? I didn't kill anyone, Abigail insisted, tasting blood where her lip had split. Search the room, Joseph ordered his brothers, still pinning her to the floor. Tear it apart if you have to. Victor and Raymond began ransacking the bedroom, upending drawers, slashing the mattress with a knife, breaking open a small jewelry box that contained the few modest pieces Thomas had given her over the years. Nothing, Victor reported after several minutes of destruction. Joseph's face contorted with fury. Where is it? He demanded again, shaking Abigail hard enough to make her teeth rattle. I told you, I don't know what you're talking about. Bring her downstairs, Joseph ordered, pulling her to her feet roughly. Get Harriet. She knows how to make women talk. They dragged Abigail to the kitchen, Joseph gripping her hair so tightly that tears sprang to her eyes despite her determination not to show weakness. Victor was sent to fetch Harriet, while Raymond continued searching the downstairs rooms. Stanley hovered uncertainly in the doorway, clearly uncomfortable, but making no move to help her. Your cousin was a good man, Abigail said to him, trying to find an ally. He would be ashamed of what you are doing. Don't talk about Thomas, Stanley muttered, unable to meet her eyes. You didn't know him. Not really. I was his wife for 5 years. I held him as he died. What do you know of him beyond a shared name? Joseph yanked her head back painfully. Shut up. You don't get to speak of family to us. The front door opened and Harriet swept in, followed by Victor. She took in the scene with a satisfied smile that chilled Abigail to her core. Well, well, Harriet said, setting down a basket she'd brought with her. The grieving widow. caught in her lies at last. She claims not to know about the map, Joseph informed his wife. But Stanley saw her with it yesterday. I saw paper in her hand, Stanley clarified, still looking uncomfortable. I assumed, of course she knows, Harriet interrupted, approaching Abigail with the air of a cat stalking a cornered mouse. She's just being stubborn. But we can fix that, can't we? From her basket, Harriet withdrew a pair of shears, the kind used for shearing sheep. The blades caught the lamplight, cold and menacing. What are you doing? Abigail asked, unable to keep the fear from her voice. Teaching you a lesson about theft, Harriet replied calmly. About respect, about knowing your place. She turned to Joseph. Hold her still. Understanding dawned, and Abigail began to struggle in earnest. No, you can't. We can, Harriet said, opening and closing the shears with deliberate slowness. And we will, unless, of course, you'd like to tell us where you've hidden the map and letter. Abigail thought of Thomas's letter, of his warning about his mother's family. If she gave them what they wanted, they would kill her. She was certain of it. Her only hope was to endure whatever they planned and escape at the first opportunity. I have nothing to tell you, she said, lifting her chin defiantly. Harriet's smile widened. I was hoping you'd say that. Raymond grabbed Abigail's arms from behind while Joseph held her head immobile. Harriet stepped forward and without ceremony began cutting Abigail's hair. Not carefully, not with any consideration for appearance, but savagely, hacking away great handfuls of the chestnut waves that had been her pride. Abigail bit her lip to keep from crying out as the cold metal occasionally nicked her scalp, drawing blood. Locks of hair fell around her, some catching on her nightgown, others drifting to the floor like autumn leaves stripped by a cruel wind. In the Old Testament, Harriet said conversationally as she worked, they shaved the heads of women who had disgraced themselves, adulterers, thieves. She paused, bringing her face close to Abigail's. Murderers. I am none of those things, Abigail managed through clenched teeth. Aren't you? Harriet continued cutting, more deliberately now, scraping the shears against Abigail's scalp hard enough to leave raw patches. A woman who marries for money, who poisons her husband when his real family appears, who lies about inheritance that doesn't belong to her? What would you call such a creature? Abigail remained silent, focusing on a point on the far wall, refusing to give Harriet the satisfaction of seeing her break. But inside, something was crumbling. Her dignity, her sense of safety, the identity she had built as Dr. Harrington's respected wife. When Harriet finally stepped back, admiring her work, Abigail could feel the cool air on her exposed scalp, could sense how patchy and raw it must look. Much better, Harriet declared. Now everyone will see you for what you truly are. Stanley, who had watched the proceedings with increasing distress, finally spoke. That's enough, Harriet. She's learned her lesson. Has she? Harriet turned to him, shears still in hand. I don't hear her telling us where the map is. Because there is no map, Abigail cried, her composure finally cracking. There is no gold. Thomas was a doctor, not a prospector. Liar, Raymond hissed, twisting her arms until she gasped with pain. Search the study again, Joseph ordered Victor. It has to be there. Thomas wouldn't have kept it in town, not with Wells being so unreliable. As Victor left to comply, Harriet set the shears aside and withdrew something else from her basket, a small brown bottle Abigail recognized with a jolt of horror. It was arsenic, commonly used in small doses for certain ailments, but lethal in larger amounts. Do you recognize this, Mrs. Harrington? Harriet asked sweetly. You should. We found the receipt in your husband's medical ledger, ordered 3 months ago, far more than needed for legitimate medical purposes. Thomas used it to treat syphilis, Abigail explained, fear making her voice shake. In carefully controlled doses. It's a standard treatment. Or perhaps you used it to slowly poison a husband who had outlived his usefulness, Joseph suggested, especially once you learned his family was coming to claim their rightful inheritance. That's insane, Abigail protested. Thomas died of pneumonia. Ask anyone who saw him in those final weeks. They saw what you wanted them to see, Harriet said dismissively. A devoted wife nursing her dying husband. How convenient that no other doctor was called to confirm the diagnosis. There is no other doctor within 50 miles. The back door banged open as Victor returned, looking frustrated. Nothing in the study. I've torn it apart. Joseph's grip on Abigail tightened painfully. Where is it? This is your last chance before things get much worse for you. Abigail looked from face to face, seeing nothing but hatred and greed in their expressions, except for Stanley, who seemed to be wrestling with his conscience, though not enough to actively intervene. I've told you the truth, she said finally. I don't know anything about a map or gold. Thomas left me this house, his practice, and nothing else. Joseph exchanged a look with his wife, some silent communication passing between them. Then he nodded. Take her outside, he ordered Raymond, to the barn. Abigail's blood ran cold. What are you going to do? No one answered as they dragged her through the back door and across the yard to the small barn where Thomas had kept his horse and buggy. The night air was sharp against her shorn scalp, the mud cold beneath her bare feet. Inside the barn, Joseph tied her hands to a post while Raymond fetched a lantern. Harriet followed with her basket, looking almost gleeful. Last chance, Mrs. Harrington, Joseph said, his face inches from hers. Tell us where the map is, or what happens next will make the haircut seem like a kindness. Abigail gathered her courage, drawing on a well of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Do what you will. I have nothing to tell you. Joseph stepped back, nodding to Harriet, who reached into her basket and withdrew a branding iron, the kind used to mark cattle. Raymond had already started a small fire in a brazier nearby. No, Abigail breathed, understanding their intention. You can't. We can, Joseph cut her off, and we will. By morning, everyone in Whisper Ridge will know you for what you are. A thief, a murderer, a woman unfit for decent society. This isn't right, Stanley protested weakly from the doorway. Joseph, think about what you're doing. I've thought about nothing else for 12 years, Joseph replied without looking at his brother. Ever since the Yankees took everything from us. Now it's time to take it back. He turned to Harriet. Get it ready. As Harriet placed the iron in the fire, Abigail closed her eyes. She thought of Thomas, of his gentle hands and kind eyes, of his belief that healing was the highest calling. What would he think if he could see his family now preparing to torture his wife for wealth he had never sought? Thomas knew you would come, she said suddenly, opening her eyes to stare directly at Joseph. He warned me about you in his letter, about your greed, your cruelty. Joseph's face darkened. Where is this letter? Tell me. I burned it, Abigail lied. After I memorized every word, he knew you were poison, Joseph. All of you. That's why he never contacted you, never mentioned you except to warn me. Her words struck home. Joseph's face contorted with rage, and he drew back his hand to strike her. But before he could, Stanley intervened, grabbing his brother's arm. Enough, Stanley said, his voice stronger now. This has gone too far. Look at yourselves. Torturing a woman in the middle of the night? This isn't justice. It's madness. Let go of me, Joseph growled. Or I swear to God, Stanley. You'll what? Beat me like you're beating her? Brand me too? Stanley stood his ground, though he was smaller than his eldest brother. I came west with you to start over, Joseph. Not to become monsters. For a moment, it seemed Stanley's words might penetrate Joseph's rage. Then Raymond spoke from where he stood by the fire. She shot Joseph earlier, tried to kill him. Are you forgetting that? After we broke into her home, Stanley retorted. What did you expect her to do? I expected her to tell the truth, Joseph said, wrenching his arm free of Stanley's grasp. To admit what she did to Thomas, to give us what rightfully belongs to the Blackwood family. And if there is nothing to give, Stanley pressed, if Thomas really did die of pneumonia, if there is no map, no gold. A tense silence followed his questions. Abigail could see doubt flicker across Victor's face, could sense Raymond's uncertainty. Even Harriet seemed to hesitate by the fire. There is gold, Joseph insisted, though something in his tone had changed. There has to be. Why else would Thomas have come to this God-forsaken territory? Why would he have bought land here, of all places? Because he was a doctor, Abigail said quietly. Because after the war, he wanted to go where healing was needed most, where it didn't matter which side you'd fought for. Joseph stared at her, something unreadable passing across his features. For a heartbeat, Abigail thought she might have reached some human part of him that remembered the cousin he'd once known. Then Harriet spoke, shattering the moment. The iron is ready. Joseph's expression hardened once more. Do it! Joseph, no! Stanley moved to intervene again, but Raymond caught him, holding him back. Harriet approached with the glowing iron, its end shaped like a small T. For thief, Abigail realized with horror. They meant to brand her as a criminal, to mark her permanently for a crime she hadn't committed. Please, she whispered, terror finally overcoming her resolve. Please don't do this. Harriet smiled, a terrible satisfaction in her eyes. Tell us where the map is, and this stops now. I don't know about any map, Abigail cried, pulling desperately against the ropes that bound her wrists. The iron came closer, its heat radiating against her cheek. She could smell her own singed hair as it neared. Wait, Victor said suddenly. Not her face, if we're going to do this at least, not where everyone can see. Harriet paused, considering. You're right, we want her marked, not completely ruined. She redirected the iron toward Abigail's shoulder. Hold her still. Joseph grabbed Abigail, ripping her nightgown to expose her shoulder. She struggled wildly, beyond rational thought now, driven by pure instinct to escape the searing pain that was coming. In her desperation, she managed to wrench one hand free from the loosely tied rope. She clawed at Joseph's face, catching his eye. He howled in pain, releasing her momentarily, long enough for her to duck away as Harriet thrust the iron forward. The brand missed Abigail but caught Joseph's forearm. His scream echoed through the barn as the scent of burning flesh filled the air. In the confusion that followed, Abigail wrenched her other hand free and ran for the door, colliding with Stanley, who seemed frozen in horror at what was unfolding. Stop her, Raymond shouted. But Abigail was already outside, running barefoot across the muddy yard toward the surrounding darkness. Behind her, she heard Joseph's continued howls of pain, Harriet's shrill voice demanding they catch her, the sound of pursuit. But the night was on her side, swallowing her as she fled into the storm that had begun while they were in the barn. Her nightgown clung to her body, soaked through within moments. The rain stung her raw scalp and rocks cut her bare feet, but she didn't slow. She ran blindly, knowing only that she had to put distance between herself and the Blackwoods. How long she ran, she couldn't say. Time lost meaning in the darkness and the fear. Eventually, her body betrayed her, her legs giving out as she collapsed face first into the mud. She turned her face skyward, letting the rain wash away tears she refused to acknowledge. I will not die, Thomas, she whispered to the storm. I will come back. Her promise hung in the air, a covenant between the living and the dead. Then, gathering what remained of her strength, Abigail Harrington pulled herself to her feet and staggered onward into the night. Consciousness returned to Abigail in fragments. First came the sensation of warmth, then the smell of herbs, pungent and medicinal. She heard the crackle of a fire before she opened her eyes, and when she finally did, she found herself staring at an unfamiliar ceiling of rough-hewn logs. She tried to sit up but fell back with a gasp as pain lanced through her body. Every muscle protested, her feet throbbed, and her scalp felt as though it were on fire. Easy now, came a voice, female, low and melodious, with a faint trace of a southern accent. You're safe, but you need to rest. Abigail turned her head, wincing at the effort, to find a black woman in her 50s sitting beside the bed. She had a regal bearing despite her simple dress, and her dark eyes held a depth of experience that commanded respect. Where am I? Abigail managed, her voice a ragged whisper. My home, the woman replied, dipping a cloth in a basin of water and gently placing it on Abigail's forehead. About 3 miles east of Whisper Ridge. I'm Ruth Wilson. Abigail Harrington, she replied automatically, then tensed. How did I? Found you by the creek, half drowned and burning with fever, Ruth explained. Been 2 days since I brought you here. She paused, her expression softening with compassion. Whoever did this to you won't find you here. This place isn't on any maps. 2 days. Abigail tried to absorb this information through the fog of pain. 2 days of unconsciousness while the Blackwoods surely searched for her. 2 days for them to ransack her home, to spread more lies about her through town. I need to go back, she said again, trying to rise despite her body's protests. They'll take everything. Ruth's hand on her shoulder was gentle but firm. You can't go anywhere in your condition. Your feet are cut to ribbons. You've got fever from infected wounds. And your scalp, She didn't finish the sentence, but her expression said enough. Reality crashed over Abigail like a wave. Her home was lost. Her practice, her possessions, her life in Whisper Ridge, all gone. The Blackwoods had taken everything, just as they had intended. "Why did you help me?" she asked, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "You don't know me. I could be exactly what they say I am." Ruth's mouth curved in a humorless smile. "I know the look of a woman running from injustice. Seen it in the mirror often enough." She adjusted the blanket covering Abigail with practiced hands. "Besides, no criminal I ever met ran barefoot through a thunderstorm with her head shaved and her nightgown torn." Abigail closed her eyes against the sting of tears. The humiliation of her condition hit her anew, shorn like an animal, wounded, helpless. "They were looking for something," she said after a moment. "Something they think Thomas had. Gold." Ruth nodded as though this confirmed a suspicion. Men and their gold turns their hearts to stone faster than any alchemy. She stood, moving to the fireplace where a pot bubbled. "We'll talk more when you're stronger. For now, you need medicine and rest." She returned with a cup of something steaming and bitter-smelling. "Willow bark for pain, echinacea for infection, some other things." At Abigail's hesitation, Ruth added, "I was a nurse during the war. Learned medicine from both sides of the line. Your husband wasn't the only healer in these parts." The mention of Thomas sent a fresh wave of grief through Abigail, but she took the cup and drank. The liquid was indeed bitter, but she was too exhausted to care. As she drifted back into sleep, her last conscious thought was that for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt something close to safe. Days passed in a haze of fever and fitful sleep. Ruth tended to Abigail's wounds with a healer's expertise, bathing her raw scalp in cool herbal infusions, applying poultices to the cuts on her feet, spooning broth into her when she could manage it. Through her delirium, Abigail sometimes called for Thomas or cried out warnings about the Blackwoods. Each time, Ruth's steady presence would anchor her back to reality, her voice a calm in the storm of fever dreams. On the seventh day, Abigail woke clear-headed for the first time. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden beams. She carefully sat up, surprised to find the worst of the pain had subsided to a dull ache. Ruth was nowhere to be seen, but a clean dress had been laid at the foot of the bed. It was simple but serviceable, made of faded blue cotton. Beside it sat a soft scarf that Abigail understood was meant to cover her head. She rose slowly, testing her bandaged feet against the wooden floor. They stung but held her weight. The mirror above the wash basin confirmed what she already knew. Her hair was gone, replaced by an uneven stubble and scab patches where the shears had cut too deeply. Her face was thinner, paler, marked by a yellowing bruise on her cheekbone where Joseph had struck her. A stranger stared back at her, hollow-eyed and haunted. With trembling hands, she washed herself using the basin of water Ruth had left. The dress fit well enough, though it was a bit short at the ankles. The scarf she wound carefully around her head, tucking in the ends with a practiced motion she'd observed in patients who'd lost hair to illness. When she emerged from the cabin, she found Ruth in a small garden plot, harvesting herbs with methodical care. The older woman looked up, nodding with approval at seeing Abigail on her feet. "Good," Ruth said simply. "Was beginning to think you might sleep another week." "Thank you," Abigail said, the words woefully inadequate for what she owed this woman. "For everything." Ruth straightened, brushing soil from her hands. "You hungry?" "Starving," Abigail admitted, suddenly aware of the hollow feeling in her stomach. "Come help then. Work is good medicine." They prepared a simple meal together, cornbread and beans, with a handful of late greens from the garden. As they worked side by side, Abigail noticed details about Ruth's home she'd been too ill to observe before. The cabin was small but meticulously organized. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with a complex fragrance. Medical texts, some she recognized from Thomas's collection, lined a small shelf. Most surprising was a well-used microscope on a corner table, the kind Thomas had ordered from Philadelphia at considerable expense. "You were more than just a nurse," Abigail observed as they sat down to eat. Ruth's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes. "We all become more than what they say we are, if we live long enough." She broke a piece of cornbread. "Eat now, talk later." After the meal, Ruth led Abigail to the porch where two chairs faced the setting sun. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks catching the last golden light. It was peaceful in a way Whisper Ridge had never been, removed from the constant scrutiny of small-town life. "Tell me everything," Ruth said, settling into her chair. "From the beginning." So Abigail did. She spoke of Thomas and their move west after the war, of his dedication to healing regardless of a patient's background or allegiance. She described the pneumonia outbreak that had claimed his life, and the sudden appearance of the Blackwoods with their accusations and demands. She explained about the map, the letter, the gold that Thomas had never mentioned until his final warning. Ruth listened without interruption, her face revealing nothing. When Abigail finally fell silent, the sun had disappeared behind the mountains, leaving the world in purple twilight. "Your husband," Ruth said after a long pause. "He treated my cousin last spring. Bullet wound. No questions asked, even though most doctors wouldn't touch a black man with a wound like that." Abigail nodded. "That sounds like Thomas. He mentioned you, said his wife had steady hands and a good heart." Ruth's gaze was piercing now. "Also said he was worried about something, wouldn't say what." A chill ran through Abigail despite the warm evening. "When was this exactly?" "April, about 2 months before he died. 2 months before the pneumonia outbreak. Before Thomas had begun to look tired all the time. Before he'd started having stomach pains he'd attributed to overwork." "Ruth," Abigail said slowly, "do you think it's possible Thomas wasn't just worried? Do you think he might have been poisoned, like the Blackwoods claimed?" "I've been wondering that myself," Ruth admitted. "Not by you," she added quickly, seeing Abigail's expression. "But arsenic poisoning can look like many things. Pneumonia among them, especially in the final stages." The implication hung in the air between them. If Thomas had been poisoned, it hadn't been by Abigail, which meant someone else had murdered him. Someone who knew about the gold, the map, and wanted both badly enough to kill. "The Blackwoods," Abigail whispered. "They must have been in contact with Thomas before they appeared. Must have been pressuring him somehow." "Possible," Ruth agreed, "but proof is what matters now. Without it, you're just a widow with wild accusations against a respected family." She leaned forward, her expression grave. "And a widow who ran after being accused of murder herself." The reality of her situation hit Abigail anew. She had no home to return to, no practice, no standing in the community. Even if she could prove her innocence, the Blackwoods had destroyed her life in Whisper Ridge as thoroughly as if they'd burned it to the ground. "What do I do now?" she asked, hating the desperation in her voice. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, considering. "First you heal," she said finally. "Then you learn. Then you fight." "Fight? How? I'm one woman against an entire family that wants me dead." "One woman is enough if she's the right woman." Ruth rose from her chair, her silhouette dignified against the darkening sky. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow, your education begins." The following weeks took on a rhythm unlike anything Abigail had known before. Each morning began with tending to Ruth's garden, learning which plants healed, which harmed, which could do both depending on preparation and dosage. Her hands, once soft and ladylike, grew calloused from work. Afternoons were spent studying Ruth's medical texts, comparing notes with what she had learned from Thomas. Ruth's approach to medicine blended formal training with traditions passed down through generations, some from her African ancestors, others from indigenous peoples she had encountered during her travels. "Knowledge doesn't care where it comes from," Ruth told her, "only that it works." Evenings were perhaps the most transformative. As they sat by the fire, Ruth taught Abigail other skills: how to move silently through the forest, how to read weather and terrain, how to defend herself with whatever came to hand. "I was born a slave in Georgia," Ruth explained one night, demonstrating how to break free from a wrist grip. "Learned early that safety isn't given, it's taken." Abigail's body grew stronger, her mind sharper. The soft physician's wife, who had stood frozen as the Blackwoods invaded her home, was being replaced by someone harder, more capable. Her hair began to grow back, a dark stubble covering her scalp, but questions continued to haunt her. What had really happened to Thomas? Where was the other half of the map? And what was she going to do when she was strong enough to confront the Blackwoods? The answer to at least one of those questions came unexpectedly, 3 weeks into her stay with Ruth. They were sorting through dried herbs when a knock sounded at the door. The first visitor Abigail had seen since her arrival. Ruth motioned for Abigail to conceal herself in the bedroom, a precaution they had discussed for just such an occasion. Through a crack in the door, Abigail watched as Ruth admitted a tall man with broad shoulders and a serious expression. His clothes marked him as someone of means, not wealthy perhaps, but certainly more prosperous than most in the territory. A leather satchel hung at his side. "Mr. Sullivan," Ruth greeted him with a slight nod. "Your timing is interesting." "As always, Miss Wilson, your reputation for understatement remains intact," he replied, his voice carrying a hint of an Eastern education beneath a Western pragmatism. "I need your expertise." "Sit," Ruth directed, gesturing to a chair. "Show me." The man, Sullivan, rolled up his sleeve to reveal a wound on his forearm, partially healed but showing signs of infection around the edges. "Barbed wire," he explained. "Been treating it myself, but it's not responding." Ruth examined the wound with professional detachment. "You've been using whiskey and salt water." "Standard treatment." "Standard doesn't always work." She began gathering supplies from her shelves. "You're not here just for this, though. What else?" Sullivan hesitated, glancing around the cabin as if checking for listeners. "There's trouble in town. The Harrington place has new occupants. Blackwoods, they call themselves. Cousins of the late doctor, supposedly." Abigail's heart raced at the mention of her home, her hand involuntarily tightening on the doorframe. "I've heard," Ruth said neutrally, beginning to clean Sullivan's wound. "Town gossip travels, even out here. This is more than gossip. They're saying the widow poisoned her husband for his gold claim, then ran when confronted. They've taken over the practice, the house, everything." Sullivan winced as Ruth applied a poultice. "But something doesn't add up. I knew Harrington, not well, but enough to doubt he'd have married a murderer." "Why are you telling me this?" Ruth asked, bandaging his arm with efficient movements. "Because you know things, Miss Wilson. Always have." His gaze was direct now. "And because there's a rumor you took in a half-dead woman matching the widow's description a few weeks back." Abigail froze, barely daring to breathe. Ruth's expression remained impassive. "I take in many who need healing," she said evenly. "Most prefer their privacy respected." "Of course," Sullivan nodded. "I'd do the same. But if you happen to see Mrs. Harrington, you might tell her there are those in town who question the Blackwoods story, who remember a doctor who treated everyone fairly, and a wife who assisted him with dedication." Ruth finished tying off the bandage. "I'll bear that in mind. Anything else?" Sullivan reached into his satchel and withdrew a sealed envelope. "This came to my office last week, addressed to Mrs. Harrington. I thought it might be important." Ruth took the envelope, examining the seal. "You're a lawyer, then? Not just a concerned citizen?" "Gabriel Sullivan, attorney at law," he confirmed with a slight smile. "Newly established in Whisper Ridge, much to the Blackwoods' apparent dismay. They've been trying to convince the town I'm not needed." "And why would they do that?" Ruth asked, setting the envelope aside. "Lawyers ask uncomfortable questions, like why Luther Wells left town so suddenly, or how the Blackwoods established claim to property that legally belongs to Mrs. Harrington." Sullivan stood, adjusting his sleeve over the bandage. "Or why Joseph Blackwood has a peculiar burn on his arm that matches the iron found in the Harrington barn." Abigail's breath caught. Someone had noticed. Someone was asking questions. "Change that bandage tomorrow," Ruth instructed as she walked Sullivan to the door. "Keep it dry. And Mr. Sullivan, be careful who you trust in Whisper Ridge." "Always, Miss Wilson." He tipped his hat. "Always." After he left, Abigail emerged from the bedroom, her heart pounding. "Can we trust him?" Ruth handed her the envelope. "We can trust he has his own reasons for opposing the Blackwoods. Whether those align with yours remains to be seen." The envelope bore the return address of the San Francisco law firm where Thomas had occasionally sent correspondence. With trembling hands, Abigail broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. "Dear Mrs. Harrington, it is with great sadness that I write following the news of Thomas's passing. He was not only a client but a friend whose moral character I deeply respected. Per his instructions, in the event of his untimely death, I am to inform you of certain matters he entrusted to our firm. 3 months ago, Thomas deposited a sealed package with us to be delivered to you alone should anything happen to him. He expressed concern about relatives who might attempt to claim his property. specifically mentioning cousins named Blackwood. The package remains in our safekeeping in San Francisco. Thomas was explicit that it should not be sent by post or entrusted to any third party. You must retrieve it personally with verification of your identity. Additionally, Thomas instructed me to tell you, should the need arise, that the river runs both ways. He seemed to think you would understand the significance of this phrase. I remain at your service in this difficult time. Jonathan Mercer, Esquerro. Abigail read the letter twice, her mind racing. The river runs both ways, she murmured. What does that mean? Ruth, who had been reading over her shoulder, pointed to the date on the letter. 3 months ago, before he got sick. Before he was poisoned, Abigail corrected, certainty growing within her. Thomas knew they were coming. He was preparing for it. She looked up at Ruth. I need to go to San Francisco. Not yet, Ruth cautioned. You're stronger, but not strong enough. And the Blackwoods will be watching the stage routes, the trains. Then what do I do, wait here while they profit from Thomas's murder? No, Ruth said, her expression thoughtful. You prepare, and you find allies. She gestured to the door where Sullivan had departed. Starting with a lawyer who's already asking the right questions. The next day, Ruth left to deliver medicines to patients in outlying homesteads, an errand that would keep her away until evening. She gave Abigail strict instructions to remain indoors, out of sight of anyone who might pass by. Alone in the cabin, Abigail found herself drawn to Ruth's bookshelves. Beyond the medical texts she'd already studied were volumes on law, geography, and history. One book in particular caught her eye, a survey of Nevada Territory mining claims published 5 years earlier. She was deep in its pages, searching for any mention of a Harrington claim, when she heard the unmistakable sound of approaching horses. Panic flared as she remembered Ruth's warning. She moved quickly to the window, peering through the curtain. 2 riders approached. Not Blackwoods, thankfully, but strangers. One was Gabriel Sullivan, recognizable from the previous day. The other was a younger man, perhaps in his early 20s, with the sunburned look of someone who worked outdoors. They dismounted at the hitching post, and Sullivan approached the door with a purposeful stride. After a moment's hesitation, Abigail opened it before he could knock. Sullivan's expression registered surprise, quickly masked. Mrs. Harrington, he acknowledged with a slight bow. I hoped I might find you here. Mr. Sullivan, she did not invite him in, keeping one hand hidden in the folds of her skirt, where she gripped the small knife Ruth had given her for protection. What brings you back so soon? Information I thought you should have immediately. His gaze was direct, assessing. May we speak inside? My associate can wait with the horses. Abigail hesitated, then stepped aside. Ruth might scold her later for the risk, but instinct told her this was important. Once inside, Sullivan removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked prematurely with silver at the temples. His face was weathered but intelligent, with eyes that missed nothing. I apologize for the intrusion, he began, but events are moving quickly in town. The Blackwoods have convinced Sheriff Taylor to issue a warrant for your arrest on charges of murder and theft. Cold fear washed over Abigail. They can't possibly have evidence. They have a witness who claims to have seen you purchasing arsenic privately, beyond what was recorded in your husband's medical ledger. That's a lie. I believe you, Sullivan said calmly, but the sheriff is susceptible to pressure from certain quarters. The Blackwoods have been quite generous in their contributions to his re-election fund. Abigail sank into a chair, the implications clear. So I'm to be hunted like a criminal. Unless we act first. Sullivan placed his satchel on the table and withdrew several documents. I've been investigating the Blackwoods since before your husband's death, Mrs. Harrington, though our paths never crossed directly. Investigating them? Why? Sullivan's expression turned grim. Because Joseph Blackwood and his brothers are involved in a land fraud scheme that stretches from Virginia City to San Francisco. They've been acquiring properties through various means, some legal, most not, then selling them to the Central Pacific Railroad at inflated prices. The railroad, Abigail frowned. What does this have to do with Thomas or the gold? Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. Sullivan spread out a map of the territory. Your husband owned land here, here, and here. He pointed to 3 parcels, one of which contained their home in Whisper Ridge. All three sit along the proposed route for the railroad's new spur line, land that would be worth considerably more once that information becomes public. Understanding dawned. They wanted his land for the railroad deal, not because of any gold. That was my theory, Sullivan nodded, until I found this. He produced another document, a survey report dated 6 months earlier. Your husband commissioned a mining survey of the northern parcel. The results were kept private, but I have contacts in the surveyor's office. Abigail scanned the report, her eyes widening at the estimated gold deposits. This can't be right. Thomas never mentioned any of this. Perhaps he wanted to protect you, Sullivan suggested. Or perhaps he was planning to use the information in some other way. A memory surfaced. Thomas working late in his study, looking troubled when she'd brought him tea. Some inheritances are burdens rather than blessings, he'd said cryptically. The land, Abigail said slowly, the northern parcel, it borders the Paiute Reservation, doesn't it? Sullivan looked impressed. It does. In fact, there's been some dispute about whether it was properly ceded in the last treaty. He studied her with new interest. You think that's significant? Thomas treated several Paiute families last winter. He spoke highly of their chief, Eagle Eye. Abigail rose and began pacing, pieces falling into place. The river runs both ways, she murmured. I'm sorry? It's what Thomas told his lawyer to tell me. The river runs both ways. She turned to Sullivan. The Truckee River. It forms the boundary between the northern parcel and the reservation. Thomas once said boundaries are human inventions. Nature doesn't recognize them. Sullivan's eyes lit with understanding. You think he meant the gold deposit extends onto reservation land? I think Thomas discovered that the richest part of the vein was on Paiute land, yes, and I think he was planning to tell them. Sullivan let out a low whistle. That would have been explosive. The territory government would have moved quickly to renegotiate the treaty, pushing the boundary back. He shook his head admiringly. Your husband was either very brave or very foolish. He was principled, Abigail said sharply. He believed in justice even when it was inconvenient. My apologies, Sullivan said, genuine contrition in his voice. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. He gathered the documents, returning them to his satchel. This information gives us leverage, Mrs. Harrington. But we need more than theories to counter a murder charge. I need to get to San Francisco, Abigail said. Thomas left something with his lawyer there, something he thought would protect me. Sullivan nodded thoughtfully. The stage would be watched, as would the train from Reno. But there are other ways to travel, less official routes. He hesitated, then added, I could arrange it, if you are willing to trust me. Abigail studied him carefully. Why are you helping me, Mr. Sullivan? What's your interest in all this? A shadow passed across his features. I've seen what happens when powerful men use their influence to crush those weaker than themselves. The law is meant to protect everyone equally, but too often it becomes a tool for the privileged. He straightened, professional demeanor returning. Besides, you're innocent of the charges against you. That should be reason enough for any officer of the court. She wasn't entirely convinced, but her options were limited. When could we leave? We? Sullivan raised an eyebrow. I assumed you'd want to make the journey alone. You assumed wrong. I need to retrieve what Thomas left, but I also need to understand why the Blackwoods wanted him dead. You've been investigating them for months. We can help each other. A slow smile spread across Sullivan's face. Mrs. Harrington, I believe I've underestimated you. He extended his hand. Partners, then? In pursuit of justice? Abigail took his hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that suggested he was no stranger to hard work despite his profession. Partners, she agreed, but I have one condition. Name it. I need to speak with Ruth before making any decisions. She saved my life. I won't disappear without her knowledge or blessing. Sullivan nodded. Of course, I'll return tomorrow morning. We can finalize plans then. He moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing you should know. The Blackwoods have offered a reward for information leading to your capture. $500. Abigail absorbed this with grim resignation. That's quite a sum. Yes, Sullivan agreed. Enough to turn many a desperate settler into a bounty hunter. Be careful who you trust, Mrs. Harrington. Even those who seem friendly may have ulterior motives. After he left, Abigail returned to the window, watching until the riders disappeared from view. Sullivan's warning echoed in her mind. Trust had become a luxury she could ill afford. But if she couldn't trust, how could she survive? How could she obtain justice for Thomas? She needed allies, information, resources, all things that required some degree of faith in others. The irony wasn't lost on her. Thomas had always believed in people's better nature, had trusted that kindness would be met with kindness. That trust might have cost him his life. She couldn't make the same mistake, but neither could she navigate this alone. When Ruth returned that evening, Abigail recounted her conversation with Sullivan, including his offer to help her reach San Francisco. Ruth listened in silence, her expression unreadable. "What do you think?" Abigail asked when she'd finished. "Can he be trusted?" Ruth took her time responding, stirring the stew she'd set to simmer over the fire. "Gabriel Sullivan is a man with his own agenda," she said finally. "Whether that agenda aligns with yours depends on what he's not telling you." "What do you mean?" "I mean, every man has his reasons for what he does. Some are honest about them. Most aren't." Ruth tasted the stew, adding a pinch of dried herbs. "Sullivan has been asking questions about the Blackwoods for months, long before your husband died." Abigail considered this. "He mentioned they had history." Ruth nodded. "The kind of history that leaves scars." She set down her spoon and faced Abigail directly. "During the war, Sullivan was a captain in the Union Army, decorated for bravery at Antietam." "How do you know this?" A small smile touched Ruth's lips. "People talk freely around those they think can't matter. I worked in field hospitals for both sides. Heard many things not meant for my ears." "And Sullivan's connection to the Blackwoods?" "Joseph Blackwood was a major in the Confederate cavalry. His unit was responsible for a massacre of Union soldiers who had surrendered, a violation of the rules of war. Sullivan's younger brother was among the dead." Abigail's breath caught. "You think he's using me for revenge?" "I think his desire for justice may be personal rather than professional," Ruth corrected. "Doesn't mean he won't help you. Just means you should understand his motives." Abigail paced the small cabin, processing this revelation. If Sullivan has been investigating the Blackwoods since before Thomas died, he might have information about who poisoned Thomas. Or he might have been so focused on Joseph he missed what was happening to your husband, Ruth pointed out. "Either way, his goal is to bring down the Blackwoods. Yours is to clear your name and honor Thomas's wishes. Remember the difference." "What would you do?" Abigail asked, genuinely curious. "If you were me?" Ruth considered the question as she served the stew into 2 bowls. "I'd go to San Francisco," she said finally, "but not with Sullivan alone. You need someone whose priority is your safety, not their own justice." "Will you come with us?" The question surprised Abigail as much as Ruth, but once spoken, she knew it was right. Ruth's eyebrows rose. "Leave my practice, my patience, just long enough to retrieve what Thomas left. A week, perhaps 2. Abigail leaned forward earnestly. "Ruth, you're the only person I trust completely, and your medical knowledge might be crucial if we need to prove Thomas was poisoned." "A black woman traveling with a suspected murderess and a lawyer with a vendetta," Ruth said dryly. "What could possibly go wrong?" Despite the sarcasm, Abigail sensed Ruth was considering it. "You said knowledge doesn't care where it comes from," she pressed. "Neither does justice. Help me find it." Ruth was silent for a long moment. Then she sighed, the sound of someone recognizing an inevitable conclusion. "My cousin Jeremiah can look after my patients. He's trained enough for basic care." She fixed Abigail with a stern look. "But we do this my way. No unnecessary risks, no charging blindly after revenge." Relief washed over Abigail. "Agreed. Thank you, Ruth." "Don't thank me yet," the older woman replied, pushing a bowl of stew toward her. "We might all end up swinging from Blackwood ropes before this is done." Sullivan seemed surprised but not displeased when Abigail informed him the next morning that Ruth would be joining them. If anything, he appeared to have expected it. "The more allies, the better," he said pragmatically. "Miss Wilson's reputation as a healer could provide useful cover for our journey." They spent the day making preparations. Sullivan had arranged for a wagon, not the fancy lawyer's buggy he usually drove, but a weathered farm cart that would attract less attention. Ruth packed medicines and supplies, while Abigail studied the maps Sullivan had brought, memorizing alternative routes should they need to separate. "We'll leave before dawn," Sullivan explained as evening approached. "Travel by day, but keep to less frequented roads. It's 3 days to the California border, then another 4 to San Francisco if we make good time." "And if we're discovered?" Abigail asked. "Then we adapt," he replied simply. "I have friends along the way, people who owe me favors." Ruth snorted softly at this, but made no comment. She had been watchful all day, observing Sullivan with the careful eye of someone accustomed to assessing character in difficult circumstances. As night fell, Sullivan departed to make final arrangements, promising to return at first light. Once he was gone, Ruth turned to Abigail with a determined expression. "Time for your final lesson," she said, retrieving a small wooden box from beneath a floorboard. Inside lay a revolver, well-maintained despite its obvious age. Ruth handled it with the ease of long familiarity, checking the cylinder before passing it to Abigail. "I can't," Abigail protested, not touching the weapon. "I've never fired a gun." "And that nearly got you killed at the Blackwood's hands," Ruth pointed out. "You fired your husband's pistol in self-defense, but you weren't prepared. This time you will be." Reluctantly, Abigail took the revolver, surprised by its weight. "Thomas believed healing and harming couldn't come from the same hands," she said quietly. "Thomas never had his head shaved by people who wanted him dead," Ruth replied bluntly. "Sometimes survival requires compromise. Doesn't mean you stop being a healer. Just means you live long enough to keep healing." They moved outside, where Ruth had set up targets, tin cans on a fallen log at varying distances. For the next hour, she instructed Abigail in loading, aiming, and firing, correcting her stance and grip with the same attention to detail she brought to medical procedures. Abigail's first shots went wild, but gradually her aim improved. The recoil, initially jarring, became manageable. By the time darkness made further practice impossible, she could hit the nearest targets consistently. "Not bad," Ruth acknowledged as they cleaned the weapon. "Remember, aim for the body, not the head. Bigger target, and never draw unless you intend to shoot." That night, Abigail slept fitfully, dreams filled with gunshots and Thomas's voice calling warnings she couldn't quite hear. She woke before dawn, heart racing, to find Ruth already up and dressed for travel. "It's time," the older woman said simply. They gathered their few belongings, banking the fire and securing the cabin. Ruth took one final look around her home, her expression momentarily unguarded, revealing uncertainty beneath her usual confidence. "You don't have to do this," Abigail offered, recognizing the sacrifice Ruth was making. "Yes, I do." Ruth's certainty returned as she squared her shoulders. "Some journeys we choose, others choose us." She picked up her medical bag. "Let's go find your truth, Abigail Harrington." Sullivan arrived with the wagon as the first gray light of dawn seeped into the sky. He helped them load their belongings, then assisted Ruth onto the seat with a courtesy that seemed to surprise her slightly. "Ladies," he said, taking up the reins, "our adventure begins." As the wagon pulled away from the cabin, Abigail looked back at the place that had become her sanctuary. She was leaving it stronger than she had arrived. Not just physically, but in spirit. The broken woman who had collapsed in the mud 3 weeks earlier was gone, replaced by someone with purpose and determination. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger. But for the first time since Thomas's death, Abigail felt something beyond grief and fear. She felt resolve. Whatever the Blackwoods had taken from her, home, reputation, security, they hadn't taken her will to fight. And fight she would, not just for herself, but for Thomas and the justice he had believed in so deeply. The wagon crested a small rise and the cabin disappeared from view. Abigail turned to face forward toward San Francisco and the answers that awaited her there. "The river runs both ways," she murmured to herself. Thomas's clue still mysterious but somehow reassuring. Water always found its path, no matter what obstacles stood in its way. So would she. The first day of travel passed uneventfully. Sullivan kept to his promised route, secondary roads that wound through hills and valleys, avoiding the main stage route where word of a reward might have spread. They encountered few travelers, mostly farmers hauling produce to local markets, who paid little attention to a plain wagon carrying a lawyer and 2 women. Ruth had insisted Abigail maintain her disguise. the scarf wrapped carefully around her head, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles Sullivan had provided to alter her appearance. They had also agreed on a cover story. Ruth was traveling to treat Sullivan's ailing mother in San Francisco, with Abigail as her assistant. They made camp that evening in a small grove of cottonwoods beside a creek, far enough from the road to avoid casual discovery. As Ruth prepared a simple meal, Sullivan unfolded his maps, tracking their progress. "We're making good time," he observed, marking their position with a pencil. "Should reach the Murphy place by tomorrow evening. They'll provide shelter, no questions asked." "Friends of yours?" Abigail asked, gathering firewood. "Friends of justice," Sullivan replied with a slight smile. Jim Murphy was a Union soldier who married a Southern girl after the war. They understand that conflict isn't always as simple as North versus South. Ruth snorted softly. For some, it was exactly that simple. Sullivan glanced at her, something like respect in his expression. "You're right, Miss Wilson. For those in bondage, the sides were clear enough." He returned to his map. "The Murphys also happened to be situated perfectly for our route, remote enough to be safe, but connected enough to have heard any news from Whisper Ridge." Abigail sat beside the small fire Ruth had built, warming her hands against the evening chill. "What do you think the Blackwoods will do when they realize I've left the area?" "Expand their search, most likely," Sullivan said. "The question is whether they'll guess we're headed to San Francisco." "They might," Abigail admitted. "If they found Thomas's correspondence, they could know about the San Francisco lawyer." Sullivan's expression turned grave. "Then we'll need to be even more cautious, perhaps alternate our route further." He traced potential paths with his finger. "It will add time, but safety is worth the delay." As darkness fell completely, they took turns keeping watch. During her shift, Abigail found herself studying Sullivan's sleeping form, wondering about the man who had so readily joined their dangerous journey. Ruth's revelation about his brother's death at Blackwood Hands explained his motivation. But there was something else about him, a contained intensity that suggested depths beyond the professional exterior. She was still contemplating this when Ruth joined her, moving silently as was her habit. "You should sleep," the older woman said softly. "Tomorrow will be another long day." "I was thinking about Sullivan," Abigail admitted, "about whether we can truly trust him." Ruth considered this, her gaze also settling on the sleeping lawyer. "Trust is earned in small measures," as she said finally. "So far, he's earned some. Not all. And you, have I earned your trust?" The question seemed to surprise Ruth. "You wouldn't be here if you hadn't," she said simply. "Why did you help me that first night?" Abigail asked, a question that had lingered for weeks. "You didn't know me. I could have brought trouble to your door." Ruth was silent for so long that Abigail thought she might not answer. When she did, her voice carried the weight of memories. "During the war, I treated a young woman who'd been attacked by soldiers. Both sides did such things, though neither admits it now." Her gaze was distant, seeing something beyond the darkened camp. She had nothing left. No home, no family, not even the dignity of uncut hair. They'd shaved her head too, you see. Said she was a spy. Was she? Does it matter? No one deserves what they did to her. Ruth's focus returned to Abigail. "She died despite my care. Infection, despair, both claimed her in the end. When I found you by the creek, with your shorn head and that look in your eyes, I thought, not again. Not if I can help it." The simple honesty of the confession touched Abigail deeply. "Thank you," she said, inadequate words for the life Ruth had saved. Ruth nodded acknowledgement, then pointed to Abigail's bedroll. "Now sleep. I'll wake you at first light." Dawn broke gray and drizzly, a fine mist dampening everything but not heavy enough to significantly slow their progress. They continued west, the terrain gradually becoming more rugged as they approached the Sierra Nevada foothills. Sullivan drove with quiet competence, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing bits of local history. By mid-afternoon, the drizzle had stopped, though dark clouds still scudded across the sky. They had just begun to climb a long, winding grade when the sound of approaching riders reached them. "Off the road," Sullivan said sharply, guiding the wagon onto a narrow track that led into a stand of pines. They had barely concealed themselves when 5 horsemen came into view. Not the Blackwoods, as Abigail had feared, but a rough-looking group that Sullivan identified as bounty hunters. Local men, he whispered as they watched the group pause at the junction. I recognize Jackson and Dieter from Virginia City. Mean as snakes and twice as venomous. They're looking for me, Abigail realized, noting how the men studied the ground for tracks. $500 is a fortune to men like that, Ruth murmured. They'll keep searching until they find you or someone else does. The riders conferred briefly, then split up. 3 continuing along the main road, 2 turning onto the track where the wagon was hidden. They've seen our tracks, Sullivan muttered. Ladies, I suggest you prepare for an unpleasant encounter. Ruth had already retrieved her revolver from beneath the seat. Abigail followed suit, her hand remarkably steady as she checked the cylinder, just as Ruth had taught her. Sullivan raised an eyebrow at their readiness, but made no comment. He urged the horses deeper into the trees, seeking better cover, but the wagon was too large to hide effectively on the narrow track. Let me handle this, he said as the riders approached. Stay calm and follow my lead. The bounty hunters slowed as they caught sight of the wagon, their hands drifting to their weapons. The older of the two, a weathered man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, studied them suspiciously. Afternoon, he called, his voice raspy. You folks lost? Not at all, Sullivan replied easily. Just taking shelter from the rain. My mother's health is delicate. He gestured to Ruth, who had quickly adopted the posture of an elderly woman, her face partially hidden by her bonnet. The younger hunter, barely out of his teens, but with cold eyes that had seen too much, spat tobacco juice. Mighty strange place to stop, middle of nowhere. My mother's nurse insisted, Sullivan explained. Miss Jenkins is quite particular about avoiding drafts. He nodded toward Abigail, who kept her head down, the spectacles and scarf obscuring her features. The scarred man edged his horse closer, peering at the wagon's occupants. You folks come from Whisper Ridge Way? Carson City, Sullivan lied smoothly, heading to Sacramento for my mother's treatments. That's so? The younger man circled to the other side of the wagon, hands still resting on his pistol. Funny, road from Carson don't usually come this way. We're taking a scenic route, Sullivan said, his friendly demeanor unchanged, though Abigail could sense the tension in him. Mother enjoys the mountains, don't you, Mother? Ruth coughed weakly, playing her role perfectly. So pretty, she murmured in a quavering voice, nothing like her usual confident tones. The scarred man seemed about to ask another question when his companion suddenly drew his weapon, pointing it directly at Abigail. It's her, he exclaimed. The Harrington woman. $500 right there. Sullivan moved with unexpected speed, drawing a derringer from his coat pocket and aiming it at the younger man. Lower your weapons, son. There's been a mistake. No mistake, the scarred man countered, his own gun now trained on Sullivan. That's the doctor's wife, sure as I'm breathing. Poisoned her husband and stole his gold map. I did no such thing, Abigail said, abandoning pretense. She raised her own revolver, keeping it steady despite her racing heart. My husband was murdered by the Blackwoods. They're the ones who should be hunted. A tense standoff ensued, 4 weapons drawn, no one willing to fire first. Ruth had also revealed her revolver, though she kept it partially concealed in the folds of her skirt. 3 against 2, Sullivan observed calmly. Poor odds for you, gentlemen. Perhaps we could discuss this rationally. Ain't nothing to discuss, the younger man snarled. That woman's worth $500. And how much is your life worth? Ruth asked, her voice returning to its normal, authoritative tone. Because I guarantee you won't collect that reward if you're dead. The scarred man hesitated, a calculating look crossing his features. Maybe we could come to an arrangement, he suggested. Split the reward, 4 ways instead of 2. Or, Sullivan countered, you could consider a different proposition altogether. He kept his derringer steady. The Blackwoods are land swindlers and murderers. I have evidence that will bring them down. Evidence worth far more than $500 to the right people. This caught the bounty hunter's attention. What kind of evidence? The scarred man asked cautiously. Documents proving they've been selling fraudulent land claims to the railroad. When exposed, there will be substantial rewards for those who help bring them to justice. Sullivan spoke with such conviction that even Abigail almost believed him, though she knew no such evidence existed yet. The 2 men exchanged glances, clearly tempted by the prospect of greater reward than the one currently being offered. Why should we believe you? The younger one demanded. Because Gabriel Sullivan doesn't lie about the law, said a new voice. All heads turned to see a man emerging from the trees, rifle in hand, but not raised. He was middle-aged, with the solid build of a farmer and the watchful eyes of a former soldier. Jim, Sullivan acknowledged with evident relief, your timing is impeccable. Followed these two when they turned off toward my property, Jim explained, not taking his eyes off the bounty hunters. Figured they might be up to no good. He addressed the scarred man directly. Jackson, you're on my land now. That means you play by my rules or you leave, preferably alive. Jackson clearly recognized the newcomer and didn't like the change in odds. Murphy, this doesn't concern you. We're after a fugitive. If she's with Sullivan, she's under my protection, Murphy said flatly. Now lower those weapons before this gets messy. A tense moment passed before Jackson reluctantly holstered his gun, motioning for his companion to do the same. This isn't over, he warned, glaring at Abigail. The Blackwoods want you bad, lady. They'll keep coming. Then let them come themselves instead of sending hired guns, she replied evenly. The bounty hunters backed their horses away, then turned and rode off, occasionally glancing behind as if expecting pursuit. Once they were out of sight, Murphy approached the wagon, his expression concerned. You all right, Gabe? Ladies? Thanks to your arrival, Sullivan said, returning his derringer to his pocket. Jim Murphy, may I present Mrs. Abigail Harrington and Miss Ruth Wilson. Murphy tipped his hat to the women. Ma'am, miss, welcome to Murphy's Crossing, though I must say you've chosen dangerous times to travel. Danger found us, Mr. Murphy, not the other way around, Abigail replied. Murphy studied her with shrewd eyes. So I gather. Well, no sense staying here where they might return with friends. Follow me to the house. Martha will have supper waiting, and we can talk more comfortably there. As they followed Murphy's horse through the trees, Ruth leaned closer to Abigail. That was well handled, she murmured. You didn't panic. I was terrified, Abigail admitted softly. Being brave isn't about not feeling fear, Ruth replied. It's about not letting fear make your decisions for you. The words echoed in Abigail's mind as they emerged from the forest into a cleared valley where a substantial farmhouse stood, smoke rising invitingly from its chimney. She had indeed been afraid, but she had also been ready to defend herself, to fight for her life and her truth. Perhaps that was the most important lesson Ruth had taught her. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. Murphy's Crossing proved to be more than a simple farm. The sprawling property housed several families, forming a small community, knit together by shared hardships and mutual protection. The main house stood at the center, sturdy and welcoming, with a wide porch that wrapped around three sides. Martha Murphy, a handsome woman with iron-gray hair and kind eyes, welcomed them without questions, ushering them into a warm kitchen filled with the aroma of baking bread. Only after they were seated with steaming cups of coffee did she exchange a meaningful glance with her husband. So, Jim said, settling into his chair at the head of the table, Gabriel Sullivan shows up on my doorstep with two ladies and bounty hunters on his tail. There's a story there, I'd wager. Sullivan nodded, his expression serious. A story of murder, theft, and corruption, Jim. The kind that needs trustworthy ears. And you thought of us. Martha's tone made it a statement rather than a question. I did, Sullivan confirmed. Mrs. Harrington's situation touches on matters we've discussed before. Railroad interests, land grabs, justice denied. Jim studied Abigail with newfound interest. You'd be the doctor's widow then, from Whisper Ridge. I am, Abigail acknowledged, meeting his gaze steadily. Folks are saying you poisoned him, Jim continued bluntly, then ran when confronted. People say many things, Mr. Murphy. Few of them true. Abigail's voice remained calm despite the accusation. My husband was murdered by the Blackwoods for his land and a gold claim they believed he possessed. Martha made a small sound of disgust. Blackwoods. Should have known they'd be involved. She set down her coffee cup with a decisive click. Nasty family. Joseph Blackwood tried to buy our eastern parcel last spring. When Jim refused, suddenly our water rights were being questioned. They operate the same way everywhere, Sullivan explained. Pressure, threats, eventually violence if necessary. They've been acquiring land along the proposed railroad spur, then selling it to Central Pacific at inflated prices. And your husband's land? Jim asked Abigail. Thomas owned 3 parcels, she replied, remembering Sullivan's map, all strategically valuable for the railroad. But there was more to it than that. With careful precision, Abigail laid out what they had pieced together. The gold deposit that extended onto Paiute land, Thomas's likely plan to inform the tribe, and the Blackwoods' desperate attempts to locate a map they believed would lead them to the gold. Thomas left something with his lawyer in San Francisco, she concluded. Something he thought would protect me if anything happened to him. That's where we're headed. Jim and Martha exchanged another of their silent communications, a language developed through decades of partnership. You're welcome to shelter here as long as needed, Jim said finally. But I should warn you, those bounty hunters will talk. Word will spread. The Blackwoods have a long reach, and $500 loosens many tongues. We can leave at first light, Sullivan offered, but Martha shook her head. Nonsense. You'll rest properly, gather supplies, and leave when it's safest, not just soonest. She stood, her manner brooking no argument. I'll prepare the guest rooms. Jim, check if Samuel's patrol spotted anything unusual today. After she left, Jim explained, our son Samuel keeps watch on the approaches to our property. Former cavalry scout. Nothing gets past him. His expression turned grave. The Blackwoods threatened him once. Only once. They learned quickly that Murphy men aren't easily intimidated. Your family has been very fortunate, Ruth observed quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken since their arrival, and something in her tone made Jim look at her more closely. Not fortunate, Miss Wilson. Prepared. He studied her with newfound respect. You've seen your share of battles too, I'd wager. Not all of them fought with guns. Ruth inclined her head slightly, neither confirming nor denying. Every war leaves its scars, Mr. Murphy, visible or otherwise. The conversation was interrupted by Martha's return. Rooms are ready when you are. Wash basin and fresh towels for each of you. She paused, her gaze settling on Abigail's scarf-covered head. And I've set out some of my mother's tonics for hair growth, Mrs. Harrington. Old frontier remedy, but effective. Abigail touched her head, self-consciously. Thank you, Mrs. Murphy, for everything. Later, in the privacy of the simple but comfortable guest room, Abigail unwound her scarf and examined her reflection in a small mirror. The brutal haircut had grown into a dark stubble covering her scalp, with the scabbed areas healing into pale patches. She looked different, harder somehow. The soft physician's wife from Boston had been replaced by someone leaner, more vigilant. A soft knock at the door interrupted her contemplation. Ruth entered, carrying a small clay pot of salve. For your scalp, she explained, setting it on the dresser. Martha's right about frontier remedies. This will help with the scarring. Will I ever look like myself again? Abigail asked, not entirely sure she wanted to. Ruth considered her for a moment. You'll never look like who you were, she said honestly, but perhaps that's not a bad thing. The woman you were didn't survive what you've endured. The woman you're becoming just might. And who is that exactly? Abigail turned from the mirror. I hardly know myself anymore, Ruth. I'm carrying a gun, planning confrontations, considering revenge. Justice, Ruth corrected firmly. Not revenge. Thomas believed in justice. Honor his memory by seeking that, not blood. The distinction settled something in Abigail's chest. Justice, she repeated, the word feeling right on her tongue. Yes, that's what we're after. Ruth nodded approvingly. Now apply that salve and get some rest. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. Morning brought news that set their plans in motion earlier than expected. Samuel Murphy had spotted riders on the northern boundary of the property. Not bounty hunters this time, but men fitting the descriptions of the Blackwood brothers. They're casting a wider net, Sullivan observed grimly as they gathered in the kitchen. Jackson must have reported back. Then you should leave immediately, Jim advised. Take the southern trail through Charmany Pass. It's longer but less traveled. We'll misdirect anyone who comes asking. Within an hour, they were underway, the wagon loaded with fresh supplies provided by the Murphys. Martha had also given Abigail several changes of clothing and a wide-brimmed hat that provided better coverage than the scarf. My sisters, Martha explained as she helped Abigail adjust it. She rode with the Pony Express disguised as a boy, said sometimes a woman has to become someone else to survive in this world. She sounds remarkable, Abigail said, touched by the gesture. She was. Martha's eyes held old grief. Died in 64. Ambushed near Carson City. She squeezed Abigail's hand. Do what you must to get justice, Mrs. Harrington, but come back alive. That's the real victory. The Delaney Pass route proved challenging but effective. For 2 days, they saw no other travelers as they wound through rugged terrain that tested the horses' endurance and Sullivan's navigation skills. The delay chafed at Abigail, who felt an increasing urgency to reach San Francisco, but she understood the necessity of caution. On the 3rd day, as they finally descended toward more populated valleys, Ruth spotted a lone rider following their trail at a distance. Could be a hunter, Sullivan suggested, though his hand moved to the rifle tucked beside the seat. Hunters don't follow wagon tracks for hours, Ruth countered. He's been behind us since mid-morning. Abigail felt for the revolver in her pocket, drawing comfort from its solid presence. What do we do? Keep moving, Sullivan decided. But prepare for trouble. There's a way station about 5 miles ahead. We'll stop there, where there are witnesses. The way station, a crude gathering of buildings consisting of a stable, a small general store, and a saloon, appeared as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Several horses were already hitched outside, suggesting other travelers were present. Sullivan guided their wagon to the stable, arranging for the horses to be fed and watered while they sought refreshment in the saloon. Inside, they found a handful of men, miners by the look of them, drinking at rough-hewn tables. A tired-looking barkeep barely glanced up as they entered. We'll take a table by the window, Sullivan directed, gesturing to a spot where they could observe both the road and the door. Ladies, please. They had just settled when the door swung open and their pursuer entered, a lean, hard-faced man with the watchful eyes of a predator. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on their table before he approached the bar. Trouble, Ruth murmured, her hand sliding beneath her shawl where Abigail knew she kept her revolver. Not necessarily, Sullivan cautioned. Let's see what he wants. They didn't have to wait long. After obtaining a whiskey, the stranger sauntered toward their table, stopping just short of joining them. Evening, he said, his voice carrying a hint of Virginia in its cadence. Mind if I join you fine folks? Sullivan gestured to an empty chair with deceptive casualness. Be our guest, monsieur. Reynolds, Ezra Reynolds. The man sat, his movements controlled and deliberate. And you would be Gabriel Sullivan, attorney at law. His gaze shifted to Abigail. Mrs. Harrington, I presume, and the esteemed Miss Wilson. Abigail tensed at the use of her name, but Sullivan remained outwardly calm. You seem to have us at a disadvantage, Mr. Reynolds. You know who we are, but we know nothing of you. Reynolds smiled thinly. Let's just say I have a professional interest in your journey. Bounty hunter? Ruth asked bluntly. Sometimes. Reynolds sipped his whiskey. Though I prefer problem solver. Right now, you three are a problem for some very influential people. The Blackwoods, Sullivan stated rather than asked. Among others. Reynolds set down his glass. $500 is a considerable sum, Mrs. Harrington. But I'm wondering if there might be more valuable compensation available. Abigail studied the man carefully. Unlike the crude bounty hunters they'd encountered earlier, Reynolds had an air of educated calculation. What are you suggesting, Mr. Reynolds? Information, he replied simply. The kind that might be worth more than the Blackwoods gold to the right parties. Sullivan leaned forward slightly. And who might those parties be? Reynolds glanced around the saloon before lowering his voice. Let's just say certain investors in the Central Pacific Railroad are concerned about their associations with the Blackwood family, concerned enough to pay handsomely for evidence of impropriety. Understanding dawned on Abigail. You're not working for the Blackwoods. Not exactly, Reynolds confirmed. I was hired to locate you, yes, but my employers are more interested in what you know than in returning you to Whisper Ridge. Sullivan's expression remained skeptical. Convenient, and we should trust you because I could have shot you from the ridge line this morning instead of following you here for a civilized conversation. Reynolds finished his whiskey. And because I can get you to San Francisco faster and safer than your current route allows. Ruth, who had remained silent throughout most of the exchange, finally spoke. You know we're bound for San Francisco. What else do you know? Reynolds regarded her with something like respect. That Dr. Harrington left something with a lawyer named Mercer. that this something likely contains evidence about a gold deposit that crosses into Paiute territory, and that the Blackwoods have already dispatched men to intercept you before you reach the city. Abigail felt cold despite the saloon's warmth. How could you possibly know all that? My employers have resources, Reynolds said simply, and informants in surprising places. Sullivan exchanged a glance with Abigail and Ruth, a silent question passing between them. After a moment's consideration, Abigail gave a nearly imperceptible nod. "Let's say we're interested in your assistance, Mr. Reynolds," Sullivan began cautiously. "What exactly would that entail?" "Abandoning your wagon for faster transport, taking a route the Blackwoods won't anticipate, and sharing whatever information you discover in San Francisco with my employers before acting on it publicly. And in return, protection, speed, and potential allies against the Blackwoods with considerably more influence than 3 individuals on the run." Abigail considered the offer. Everything in her wanted to refuse, to trust only Sullivan and Ruth, the allies she knew. But pragmatism argued otherwise. They were still days from San Francisco, vulnerable to pursuit, and operating with limited resources. "We'll need to discuss this privately," she said finally. Reynolds nodded, standing. "Of course, I'll be outside when you've reached a decision." He tipped his hat slightly. "Don't take too long. Blackwood men were in Placerville this morning asking questions about a lawyer and 2 women heading west." After he left, the 3 conferred in hushed tones. "It could be a trap," Ruth warned, "leading us into an ambush." "Possible," Sullivan acknowledged, "but his information about our destination and Thomas's deposit was accurate. Someone with connections is clearly involved." "Central Pacific executives," Abigail mused. "If they've been buying land from the Blackwoods, they might fear exposure in any scandal. Better to distance themselves now." "Or silently eliminate the problem," Ruth countered darkly. "Us." Sullivan rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Reynolds could have attacked at any point today. Instead, he approached openly. That suggests his offer might be genuine. Or that he needs us alive to lead him to whatever Thomas left," Abigail pointed out. After further discussion, they reached a compromise. Accept Reynolds' assistance, but maintain vigilance and keep their weapons ready. As Sullivan put it, sometimes the devil you can see is preferable to the one lurking in shadows. Outside, they found Reynolds waiting beside 4 saddled horses. He had already transferred their essential supplies to saddlebags, leaving their wagon conspicuously abandoned. "Misdirection," he explained, noting their questioning looks. "Anyone following your trail will find the wagon and waste time searching the area. Meanwhile, we'll be on a route they won't expect." The horses were quality stock, better than they could have afforded on their own. Reynolds helped Ruth mount one, his manner respectful despite her initial reluctance to accept assistance. "We'll ride until midnight," he informed them, checking his pocket watch. "There's a line shack about 15 miles west where we can rest for a few hours." As they set off at a brisk trot, Abigail found herself watching Reynolds closely. His knowledge of their mission troubled her, suggesting leaks or surveillance she hadn't anticipated. Yet his manner was professional, even courteous, betraying none of the menace she'd come to expect from those pursuing her. "Mr. Reynolds," she ventured after they'd been riding for some time, "you seem well informed about our situation. I wonder what else you might know that could be useful to us." Reynolds glanced at her, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Fishing for information, Mrs. Harrington?" "Very well. I know the Blackwoods came west after losing everything in Virginia. I know they've been acquiring land through various means, some legal, many not. And I know your husband's discovery threatened their entire operation." "And your employers? What do they want from all this?" "Deniability," he replied frankly. "Central Pacific can't afford another scandal. If their land acquisitions involve fraud or murder, they need to address it before it becomes public." "By silencing us?" Sullivan asked sharply. Reynolds shook his head. "By compensating you. For your loss, Mrs. Harrington. For your legal expertise, Mr. Sullivan. In exchange for discretion." "Hush money," Ruth said bluntly. "Compensation for damages," Reynolds corrected, "along with assurances that those responsible will face consequences." Abigail considered this as they rode. "I don't want money," she said finally. "I want justice for Thomas. And I want his wishes respected regarding the Paiute land." Something like respect flickered across Reynolds' features. Then perhaps we can find a solution that satisfies both your principals and my employer's concerns. But first, we need to retrieve whatever your husband left in San Francisco. They rode well into the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. True to Reynolds' word, they reached a small line shack shortly after midnight, a crude but serviceable shelter used by ranchers tending distant herds. Inside, they found basic provisions, a stone fireplace, and enough space to spread their bedrolls. While Sullivan and Ruth slept, Abigail found herself keeping watch alongside Reynolds, both of them seated near the door. "Why did you really take this job, Mr. Reynolds?" she asked quietly, studying his profile in the dying firelight. He was silent for a moment, considering her question. "Professional interest initially," he admitted. "The bounty was substantial, but sometimes a job reveals itself to be something more significant." "And this one?" Reynolds turned to face her directly. "I fought in the war, Mrs. Harrington. Saw men kill each other over land they'd never owned and causes they barely understood. When it ended, I swore I'd only fight for things that mattered." He gestured vaguely toward the sleeping forms of Sullivan and Ruth. "What the Blackwoods did to you, to your husband, that matters." His sincerity surprised her. "Thank you for your honesty." He nodded, then added, "Get some rest, Mrs. Harrington. Tomorrow will be demanding, and San Francisco is still 2 days hard riding away." True to Reynolds' prediction, the next 2 days tested their endurance. They rode from dawn until dusk, taking routes through rugged terrain that ordinary travelers would avoid. Twice they spotted riders in the distance who might have been pursuers, but Reynolds' knowledge of the landscape allowed them to evade detection. By the time San Francisco's lights appeared on the horizon, Abigail was exhausted but determined. They had made it. Thomas's final message, the evidence he'd left to protect her, was within reach. Reynolds guided them to a modest hotel on the city's outskirts. "Better to avoid the main establishments," he explained. "The Blackwoods have contacts in the larger hotels." The proprietor, a widow named Mrs. Chen, welcomed them without asking questions, providing 2 adjoining rooms with private entrances. Only after they had washed away the dust of travel and eaten a simple meal did they discuss their next steps. "Mercer's office is on Montgomery Street," Sullivan informed them, consulting a city directory. "Banking district, respectable firm, and likely watched," Reynolds added. "The Blackwoods may not have men in the city yet, but they could have sent telegrams to associates here." Ruth, who had been characteristically quiet since their arrival, finally spoke. "Mrs. Harrington should not go herself. Too risky." "I agree," Sullivan nodded. "I can present her authorization and retrieve the package." "No," Abigail said firmly. "Thomas left it for me specifically. The letter said I must collect it personally with verification of my identity." She touched the locket around her neck, one of the few possessions she'd managed to keep. "I have our marriage certificate in this locket with our photographs. It will be enough." Reynolds considered this. "A compromise, then. Sullivan and I will scout the office first, ensure there's no obvious surveillance. If it's clear Mrs. Harrington can enter with Ruth as companion, we'll maintain positions outside to watch for trouble." The plan was set. The following morning, Sullivan and Reynolds departed first, dressed as businessmen with nothing remarkable about them. An hour later, Abigail and Ruth followed, Abigail wearing a conservative gray dress and veil borrowed from Mrs. Chen that concealed her still short hair. Mercer and Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a stone building in the heart of San Francisco's financial district. The streets bustled with activity, clerks hurrying between offices, merchants hawking wares, ladies shopping in nearby establishments. Amid such ordinary commerce, their mission felt strangely surreal to Abigail. Sullivan was waiting in a cafe across the street, positioned to observe the building's entrance. He gave a subtle nod as they passed, indicating no obvious danger had been detected. Reynolds was nowhere to be seen, but Abigail trusted he was watching from some vantage point. The law office itself was exactly what one would expect. Wood-paneled walls, leather-bound volumes lining shelves, clerks bent over ledgers at polished desks. A receptionist looked up as they entered. "May I help you, madam?" "I'm here to see Mr. Mercer," Abigail said, keeping her voice steady. "Abigail Harrington. I believe he's expecting me." The name produced an immediate reaction. The receptionist straightened, his expression turning cautious. "One moment, Mrs. Harrington." He disappeared into a back office, returning shortly with an older gentleman whose silver hair and dignified bearing marked him as a man of some standing. "Mrs. Harrington," the man greeted her, extending his hand. "Jonathan Mercer, I've been expecting you, though I must say not under such circumstances. Please come into my office." Once the door closed behind them, Mercer's professional demeanor softened slightly. "I was deeply saddened to hear of Thomas's passing. He was a fine man, one of the few clients I considered a friend." "Thank you," Abigail said, finding comfort in the genuine sentiment. "He spoke highly of you as well." Mercer gestured to chairs before his desk. "Please be seated. And your companion is?" "Ruth Wilson, my associate and trusted friend." If Mercer found anything unusual in a white woman traveling with a black companion, he gave no indication of it. "I understand from my sources that there have been complications regarding Thomas's passing." "Complications is one way to describe murder and theft," Ruth said dryly. Mercer's eyebrows rose slightly. "I see. Perhaps you should tell me exactly what's happened." Abigail provided a concise account of events since Thomas's death: the Blackwoods' arrival, their accusations, her escape and journey to San Francisco. She omitted certain details, such as Reynolds' involvement, but included enough for Mercer to understand the gravity of the situation. When she finished, Mercer's expression was grave. "This is far worse than I anticipated. Thomas mentioned concerns about his mother's family, but nothing of this magnitude." He opened a desk drawer, withdrawing a key. "I believe what he left may be even more important than I realized." He crossed to a large safe concealed behind a painting, its mechanism complex enough to require both the key and a combination. From within, he retrieved a sealed package wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string. "Thomas delivered this personally 3 months ago," Mercer explained, placing it on the desk before Abigail. "He was adamant it be given only to you and only if you came in person." The package was heavier than Abigail expected, about the size of a large book. Her hands trembled slightly as she untied the string, aware that she was about to uncover Thomas's final communication, perhaps the key to understanding his death and reclaiming her life. Inside the oilcloth was a leather-bound journal, a sealed envelope, and what appeared to be legal documents. Abigail opened the journal first, recognizing Thomas's neat, precise handwriting. The first page was addressed directly to her. "My dearest Abigail, if you are reading this, then my fears have been realized, and I am no longer with you. Forgive me for the secrecy that may have seemed like a breach of trust between us. I had hoped to shield you from a burden that was never yours to bear." The journal that follows contains a full account of what I discovered in the northern parcel, a gold deposit that extends well into Paiute territory. Under treaty law, such a discovery should be reported to territorial authorities. Under moral law, it belongs to those whose land it truly is. I have been in communication with Chief Eagle Eye of the Paiute. He is a man of wisdom and foresight. Together, we have developed a plan that could benefit his people while avoiding the usual theft that accompanies such discoveries. The legal documents enclosed establish a trust, with you and Eagle Eye as trustees. Any proceeds from carefully controlled mining operations would fund education, health care, and legal protection for the tribe. My mother's family, the Blackwoods, learned of the deposit through means I cannot determine. They have been pressing me to sell them the land, escalating from requests to threats. I fear what they might do when they realize I have no intention of giving them access to wealth that isn't mine to give. If something happens to me, take these documents to Judge William Forsyth in Sacramento. He is one of the few officials I trust completely. He will help implement what I could not finish. Know that I have loved you completely, Abigail. Whatever hardship this brings, remember that truth. Forever yours, Thomas Abiram, blurred Abigail's vision as she finished reading. Thomas had been planning not personal enrichment, but justice for people who had been repeatedly wronged. His final act had been one of principle, not profit. She passed the journal to Ruth, then opened the sealed envelope. Inside was the missing half of the map she had found in Thomas's study, along with detailed notes about the geological formation and estimated value of the deposit. Attached was a formal agreement between Thomas's and Chief Eagle Eye, signed and witnessed. He was going to make it right, Abigail said softly, looking up at Mercer. He knew the gold extended onto Paiute land, and he was going to ensure they benefited from it. Mercer nodded solemnly. Thomas always believed that healing went beyond physical medicine. He sought to heal injustices where he found them. And the Blackwoods killed him for it, Ruth stated, having finished reading the journal. We don't have absolute proof of that yet, Abigail cautioned, though in her heart she was certain. Actually, Mercer said, reaching into his desk drawer again, we might. He produced another smaller envelope. This arrived last week from a Dr. Bernard Palmer in Sacramento. He's a toxicologist, someone who studies poisons and their effects. Thomas had apparently been sending him hair and nail samples for analysis. Abigail took the envelope with a sense of dread, breaking the seal to find a clinical report written in precise medical terminology. She scanned it quickly, her medical knowledge from assisting Thomas allowing her to understand the implications. Arsenic, she confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. Progressive doses over approximately 2 months, culminating in a lethal amount shortly before his death. She looked up, anger replacing grief. They poisoned him slowly, making it appear like illness, then finished him when they thought they'd get the information they wanted. But they didn't, Ruth pointed out. Thomas outsmarted them. He protected both you and the Paiute with these documents. A sharp knock at the office door startled them. Mercer frowned, moving to answer it. One of his clerks stood there, looking anxious. Begging your pardon, Mr. Mercer, but there are men downstairs asking after Mrs. Harrington, rather insistently. The Blackwoods? Abigail asked, gathering the documents quickly. The clerk shook his head. Don't know the name, ma'am, but they're carrying weapons and making no effort to hide it. Mercer closed the door, his expression grim. We have a back exit, through my private office and down the service stairs. It leads to an alley behind the building. Sullivan and Reynolds are watching the front, Ruth reminded Abigail. They won't know we're leaving another way. We have no choice, Abigail replied, securing the package beneath her shawl. Mr. Mercer, is there somewhere safe we can regroup? Somewhere to meet our companions once we've evaded these men? My home in Pacific Heights, he offered immediately. My carriage is in the stables behind this building. My driver, Chen, can take you there directly. It was their best option. Mercer hurriedly wrote his address on a card, instructing the clerk to deliver it to the gentleman waiting in the cafe across the street once the armed men had left. Then he led Abigail and Ruth through his private office to the back exit. The service stairs were narrow and dimly lit, descending 3 floors to an alley used for deliveries. Mercer's carriage, a modest but well-maintained vehicle, waited nearby, its driver alert and ready. Take them to the house, Chen, Mercer instructed. Use the side streets. Avoid anyone who seems to be following. The driver, a middle-aged Chinese man, nodded once, understanding the urgency without needing details. As they settled into the carriage, Abigail looked back at Mercer. Thank you for everything. Just honoring my promise to a friend, he replied. Be careful, Mrs. Harrington. The documents you carry represent more than gold. They represent a different path for this territory, one that powerful interests will resist fiercely. With that sobering warning, he stepped back and Chen set the horses in motion. The carriage moved swiftly through back alleys before emerging onto a side street leading away from the financial district. Through the small window, Abigail caught glimpses of San Francisco's varied architecture, grand buildings alongside modest structures, wealthy neighborhoods giving way to working-class districts. In other circumstances, she might have marveled at the city's vitality. Now she saw only potential dangers, scanning each cross street for signs of pursuit. Do you think Sullivan received the message? She asked Ruth, who sat opposite her, revolver now openly held in her lap. If not, he and Reynolds will figure out what happened, Ruth replied confidently. They're resourceful men. Abigail touched the package concealed beneath her shawl, drawing strength from its presence. Thomas had entrusted her with his legacy, not just the protection of wealth, but the protection of justice. She would not fail him. The carriage turned onto a steep street climbing toward the heights overlooking the bay. The homes here were elegant and widely spaced, suggesting wealth and privacy. Eventually, they stopped before an impressive residence surrounded by well-tended gardens. Chen helped them descend, then led them to a side entrance rather than the main door, another precaution Abigail appreciated. A housekeeper greeted them with practiced discretion, leading them to a comfortable parlor with windows offering a commanding view of the city and harbor below. Mr. Mercer sent word ahead, the woman explained. Please make yourselves comfortable. Refreshments will be served shortly. Left alone, Abigail and Ruth took stock of their situation. They had secured Thomas's documents but become separated from Sullivan and Reynolds in the process. The Blackwoods clearly had connections in San Francisco, enough to locate them within hours of their arrival, and now they were in a stranger's home, depending on his integrity and protection. We should review everything thoroughly, Ruth suggested practically. Understand exactly what Thomas left before deciding our next move. Abigail agreed, and they spread the documents across a large mahogany table. The journal contained detailed observations about the gold deposit, geological assessments, and Thomas's moral reasoning about the rightful ownership. The legal documents established the trust he had described, with provisions for mining operations that would benefit the Paiute while minimizing disruption to their lands. Most intriguing was a separate section documenting Thomas's suspicions about being poisoned. He had noticed symptoms consistent with arsenic exposure shortly after refusing to sell his land to the Blackwoods. Rather than confront them, he had begun collecting samples and sending them to Dr. Palmer for analysis. The final entries, written in an increasingly shaky hand, revealed his certainty about the poisoning and his determination to protect both Abigail and the Paiute from his cousin's greed. He knew they were killing him, Abigail said softly, tracing her fingers over his last written words. Yet he focused on protecting others instead of saving himself. That's the measure of the man you married, Ruth observed. Now we honor him by completing what he started. A commotion at the front of the house interrupted them. Voices were raised, including one that Abigail recognized with relief. Sullivan's distinctive cadence, insistent but controlled. Moments later, the door opened to admit both Sullivan and Reynolds, the latter sporting a cut above his eyebrow, but otherwise intact. Thank God, Sullivan breathed upon seeing them. When you disappeared from Mercer's office, we feared the worst. Blackwood men arrived, Abigail explained quickly. We had to use the back exit. Mercer sent his clerk with a message. Which we received eventually, Reynolds added, touching his wound ruefully, after a brief disagreement with the gentleman looking for you. Are you hurt? Ruth asked, professional concern overriding her usual reserve. Nothing serious, Reynolds assured her, though your medical expertise would be welcome later. Sullivan approached the table, surveying the documents spread across it. So this is what Thomas left. Evidence of the gold deposit? That and more, Abigail confirmed, explaining what they had discovered about Thomas's plans for the Paiute, the trust he had established, and the proof of his poisoning. Sullivan's expression grew increasingly grave as he absorbed the implications. This goes beyond land fraud, he said finally. This is murder, conspiracy, attempted theft of tribal resources. The Blackwoods could hang for this. If we can get the evidence to the right authorities, Reynolds cautioned. Many officials in the territory are in Central Pacific's pocket, directly or indirectly. Judge Forsyth, Abigail reminded them, Thomas trusted him completely. His letter specifically instructed me to take these documents to Sacramento. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. Forsyth has a reputation for incorruptibility. If anyone would act on this evidence, it would be him. Then Sacramento is our next destination, Sullivan decided. But not immediately. The Blackwoods know we're in San Francisco now. They'll be watching the usual routes east. The sound of a carriage arriving drew their attention. Moments later, Mercer himself entered the parlor, looking relieved to find them all there. I see your companions found you, he observed. Good, we have much to discuss and limited time. He gestured toward the window where twilight was beginning to settle over the city. Joseph Blackwood arrived in San Francisco an hour ago. He's currently meeting with Central Pacific executives at their headquarters. Reynolds tensed visibly at this news. Which executives? Huntington and Stanford, Mercer replied, along with their legal counsel. This clearly meant something significant to Reynolds, who exchanged a glance with Sullivan before addressing the group. My employers will need to know about this immediately. It suggests a coordination at the highest levels. Your employers? Mercer raised an eyebrow. I wasn't aware Mrs. Harrington had additional allies. Reynolds introduced himself properly, explaining his role as a representative for interested parties within Central Pacific who opposed the Blackwoods methods. Mercer listened skeptically, but didn't dismiss the connection outright. Strange bedfellows are common enough in matters of justice, Whitey conceded. But we must act quickly now. Joseph's presence changes the calculation. He's not just seeking Mrs. Harrington anymore. He's attempting to secure support from railroad leadership. Which means he's desperate, Sullivan observed. He knows we have evidence that could destroy him. Or confident, Ruth countered. A man doesn't walk into his enemy's camp unless he believes he has leverage. Sullivan paced the parlor. Joseph meeting with railroad executives changes everything. We need a new plan. Judge Forsyth is in San Francisco for a judicial conference, Mercer announced. Thomas specifically mentioned taking the evidence to him. He's at the Occidental Hotel. Then that's where we'll go, Abigail decided. Tonight. As Mercer left to arrange a meeting, Reynolds noticed movement outside. Blackwood men, watching the house. They must have followed Mercer, Ruth concluded. There's a hidden tunnel through the wine cellar, Mercer explained upon returning. A remnant from Prohibition days, though against Chinese immigrants, not alcohol. My neighbors are sympathetic to those needing discreet exits. Judge William Forsyth, a slight man with kind eyes, but a voice carrying absolute moral certainty, received them in his private suite that evening. For an hour, Abigail methodically presented Thomas's journal, the toxicology report, the trust documents for the Paiute, and the map of the gold deposit. The judge read each document with growing fury. This goes beyond criminality. This represents a corruption of everything the law is meant to protect. Can you help us bring the Blackwoods to justice? Abigail asked. I'll issue warrants tonight, Forsyth confirmed. But if Joseph is meeting with Central Pacific executives, larger forces are at play. Reynolds straightened. I represent certain investors concerned about the company's land acquisition methods. They prefer a discreet resolution. Punish the guilty without bringing down the enterprise. Justice isn't meant to be convenient, Forsyth replied without heat. He turned to Abigail. What do you want from this, Mrs. Harrington? I want Thomas's murder acknowledged and punished. I want his wishes for the Paiute honored, and I want to live without looking over my shoulder. Reasonable desires, Forsyth nodded. Tomorrow morning I'll convene an emergency judicial hearing. The evidence will be presented publicly. Joseph will either flee, confirming his guilt, or attempt to defend himself. Or attack, Reynolds added grimly. Hence the marshals, Forsyth said, and your vigilance. The grand ballroom of the Occidental Hotel had been transformed into an impromptu courtroom by 10 o'clock the next morning. Officials, journalists, and curious onlookers filled the rows of chairs facing Judge Forsyth's table. Abigail felt countless eyes upon her as she took her seat. The whispers followed her. Speculation about her shorn hair, her identity, her connection to this mysterious proceeding. She kept her gaze forward, her posture erect. Judge Forsyth outlined the charges against the Blackwood family, presenting the evidence Abigail had brought. Gasps rippled through the audience as he detailed Thomas's poisoning, the assault on Abigail, and the attempt to steal land that rightfully belonged to the Paiute. When Abigail rose to speak, she did so with unexpected calmness. In a clear voice, she recounted everything, from Thomas's death to her escape in the storm. They shaved my head to mark me as a criminal, she concluded. But in doing so, they only revealed their own criminality. My husband died protecting justice. I stand here to complete what he began. A commotion at the back of the room interrupted her. Joseph Blackwood forced his way through the crowd, face contorted with fury. Reynolds and two marshals followed in pursuit. Lies, Joseph shouted, pointing at Abigail. Every word from this woman's mouth is poison. You orchestrated this farce, he snarled at the judge. You, Sullivan, all of you, conspiring to steal what belongs to the Blackwood family. The only conspiracy is yours, Joseph, Sullivan replied calmly. Against your own cousin, against his widow, against the law itself. You have no proof. We have Thomas's journal, his toxicology samples, the trust documents, and most importantly, your brother's testimony. Joseph blanched. Stanley has already made a full confession, Reynolds said, stepping forward, as have representatives of Central Pacific involved in your land fraud. Joseph reached for a weapon, but Reynolds pinned his arm with practiced efficiency. The marshals converged, restraining him despite his struggles. Joseph Blackwood, Judge Forsyth intoned, you are remanded into federal custody on charges of murder, conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. The following days passed in a blur of legal proceedings. The Blackwood case became a sensation, with Abigail cast as both victim and heroine. Stanley's testimony proved crucial. He described how Joseph had gradually poisoned Thomas, increasing the dosage as negotiations grew more contentious. His remorse seemed genuine. He had objected to the violence against Abigail, but lacked courage to stop it. Victor and Raymond received 15 years each. Joseph was sentenced to hang. Stanley's cooperation earned him a reduced sentence of 5 years. Harriet Blackwood fled before arrest, reportedly boarding a steamer bound for Europe. 1 week after Joseph's arrest, Abigail stood before another gathering: Paiute tribal leaders, government officials, and mining representatives. Chief Eagle Eye studied the trust documents with careful attention. "Your husband was unusual among white men," he said. "He saw beyond boundaries drawn on paper. He understood that the river runs both ways." "What does that phrase mean?" Abigail asked. "The Truckee River forms the boundary between our lands and what was your husband's property. But water does not recognize such divisions. It flows where it will, nourishing both sides equally, like the gold beneath the earth, which does not belong to one people but to the land itself." The trust was established that day, stipulating that mining operations would employ Paiute workers at fair wages, with profits funding education, healthcare, and legal protections for the tribe. Thomas's vision would be realized, though he hadn't lived to see it. "Will you return to Whisper Ridge?" Sullivan asked afterward. "No," Abigail said with certainty. "There's nothing for me there now." "San Francisco, then?" Mercer mentioned his offer. Abigail shook her head. "I need to find my own path." Ruth spoke up. "My offer stands. My cabin has room for 2 healers. The territory needs more women who understand both medicine and survival." The idea resonated deeply with Abigail: to heal others as she herself had been healed, to build something new from loss. "I'd like that," she said softly. "And you, Mr. Sullivan?" she asked. "I'll be occupied with cases against certain railroad interests for some time. Reynolds' employers are eager to distance themselves from the scandal." Reynolds approached, and having concluded a separate conversation, "Mrs. Harrington, my assignment is complete. My employers are satisfied with the outcome." "And you?" Abigail asked. "Are you satisfied?" "I began this job for the money. I continued it for justice. I completed it out of respect." He glanced at Ruth, then back to Abigail. "Not many would have shown your courage. Fewer still your restraint." They parted ways, Reynolds to a Pinkerton position in Denver, Sullivan remaining in San Francisco to pursue legal matters. Abigail and Ruth returning to the cabin where Abigail's healing had begun. On their final evening in the city, Abigail studied her reflection. The woman who gazed back was neither the confident physician's wife from Boston, nor the broken victim who had collapsed in the mud. This woman had clear eyes that had seen both cruelty and kindness. Her hair, growing back, was streaked with silver that caught the lamplight. "Some tribes believe each silver strand marks a truth learned through suffering," Ruth said quietly, "a badge of wisdom rather than age." "What do you believe?" Abigail asked. "That healing isn't returning to what we were. It's growing into what we can become. The woman you were died that night in the storm. The woman you are now was born in fire and pain, but also in courage." "And justice," Abigail added softly. "Yes, Thomas would be proud of that." The stagecoach departed San Francisco at dawn. As the city receded, Abigail felt a weight lifting. The coach eventually crested a rise, offering a panoramic view of the territory. Somewhere in that vast landscape was Ruth's cabin, where Abigail had begun her recovery, where she would now begin her new life. "The taste of recovery," she murmured. "What's that?" Ruth asked. "Something I've been thinking about. Recovery is bitter at first, then nourishing, then finally sweet. And where are you in that progression?" Abigail watched the landscape unfold before them, challenging but beautiful, harsh but full of possibility, like her own future. "Somewhere between nourishing and sweet," she decided. "And that's more than I thought possible on that night in the rain." Her hair would grow back, now threaded with silver that marked each hardship survived, each truth learned. She had lost much, but gained something perhaps more valuable: the knowledge that she could face the worst and emerge stronger. The Blackwoods had tried to mark her as shameful, but instead had only revealed her true strength. That was the final justice. Not just punishment of those who had harmed her, but the reclamation of herself, transformed by fire into something more resilient than before. The taste of recovery was indeed sweet,